Today on Radio Free History, it's episode 6 of our How Art Got Ugly series. We last left off at the end of World War I, and we're going to pick up today at the end of the war and survey the entire cultural landscape. In particular, we're going to ask why a series of paintings about water lilies is considered so significant. I hope you enjoy it. If you're watching this when it's new, there's really only one thing we can talk about because it's been in the news in the last couple of weeks. There have been all of these statues popping up all over the world of just these very generic black women, these very generic frumpy black women.
The kind of person who wouldn't help you at the DMV in the States.
Yeah, not only wouldn't help you, but give you a passive-aggressive attitude.
I just need to get my driver's license updated.
God, you following the law.
It's just...
There you go.
Whoa.
There's an expression in the current internet parlance, including the word fatigue. I'm very fatigued looking at this picture.
She's giving me a look like she's about to hit me.
Yeah.
As a bouncer for 15 years, that's my take. Is this gets me to react like I'm on my toes immediately looking at this, because this is a stance where it's like, okay, hands are low. She's kind of got her weight back. Like, this is what I'm about to hit you.
Oh, this is supposed to be the stance of Michelangelo's David. That's the best part of it.
Fine. This is our new Achilles. Yeah. That's great.
But look, she's just generic biomass. There's nothing. There's nothing special. There's nothing notable about this woman. She's wearing loose-fitting clothes. Those tits are unfortunate.
There's nothing aspirational. There's nothing aspirational about this piece. This doesn't reflect anything of meaning in our culture. It doesn't make us strive for anything. It's just kind of blah. It's like a mirror would do the same thing.
So Anthony Cumia of the Opie and Anthony Show fame, he posted an AI video of this statue getting off this plinth and then climbing the Empire State Building.
Now that's funny, because when Hitler saw King Kong, he was convinced that it was about black sexuality in America.
Huh?
So we're hitting on similar themes here. And people tell me you gotta think very carefully about how your art affects people. Well,
yeah.
You got to think very carefully about how this might affect a very broad audience.
Well, and just like everything else in art since about 50 years ago, the guy who made this, his name was Thomas Price. The piece is called Grounded in the Stars, because of course it is. Just like every other piece of pretentious modern art, he says he hopes the statue is going to instigate meaningful connections.
It's a conversation.
It's just a meaningless statement. And not only that, he said it's going to allow for a deeper reflection around the human condition and greater cultural diversity. A word salad with no meaning in it. That's just a completely vacuous statement, especially in the art world.
It's like this. I feel like maybe he did this through AI.
Yeah.
Like that. I feel like this is almost an AI.
This was not done by like Michelangelo with the chisel. He did not look at a piece of marble or whatever the fuck this thing's made out of. This may have just been 3D printed with filament for all I know. This was not he did not spend 5 years thinking, okay, this statue of this Shaniqua is inside this block, just waiting to get out.
Yeah. This is again, just I feel like homie stole a random picture off somebody's social media and made a giant statue. It's just, you don't want to see mediocrity reflected in your art.
There have been these statues of very plain, generic black women popping up all over the world. Like this is in Florence. Same guy who made this.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I know.
What are you trying to say? I don't get it. It's got no, even if, I assume this is supposed to be some great rhetorical argument, there's no rhetorical punch.
No. I don't know if she's supposed to be wearing a beanie or something, or she's waiting to get her weave fixed.
If I publish this on my social media, a series of pictures of young black women on social media, on their cell phones, I would be called a racist.
Yeah.
Because I'm perpetuating this stereotype of this aloof young black woman.
Well, even in the 70s, when you think of Soul Train, the black female body used to be like a sex symbol. Now it's like There's a reason that black women, nobody matches with them on dating apps, because this is the reason. Would you want to match with this?
Well, it's like my buddy had a saying. He said, like, if you date an Indian girl and you screw up, she's going to send her cousins over to beat you up. If you date a black girl, same problem. If you date a white girl, what's she going to do? She's going to go home and cry. Mm-hmm. So I think there's cultural reasons for that, too. I think it's like, there's a high likelihood of a very drama, a tightly knit family group centered around a matriarch with a lot of drama and a lot of family obligations. I think when you look at somebody of African diaspora or sub-Saharan African diaspora on a dating app, you kind of know that, okay, there's going to be this big dramatic family. And that's a sell for some people, but it's not for most.
A big dramatic family with one specific male member missing.
And the male members that stuck around, they're going to be like, they're going to have SoundCloud in all likelihood. So you're going to have to deal with that. It's almost as bad as having a podcast. Anyways.
Well, I guess it doesn't just stop with Times Square and Florence. And, okay, you've done one statue of a vapid black woman staring at her smartphone. One's not enough. This is in London.
Again, I would be called a racist. If I published these, this would be like, why are you capturing these women at their worst?
Yeah.
Or least attentive? Why? This is just a very negative, mediocre image of the urban female. I feel the same way about this that I would feel about like a bunch of like sculptures of like hayseed white people from meth country.
Yeah.
Like this isn't, why would you sculpt that?
She's even wearing Nike sneakers. Like
sneakers are a big deal in that community.
Yeah, I know, but like if you're trying to do something that gets to the human condition, like a brand name symbol is like the last thing you want on that.
No, exactly.
This is called reaching out. Again, the same.
Makes me wonder about sponsorship. To be honest with you, I wouldn't put it past Nike at this point to have these statues, but it's just again, you are reflecting with this a mediocre passing image, and it's being packaged as like black liberation. But if were I a black person, I would feel very condescended to, and I'd feel like very badly represented through these pieces of art.
The funny thing is if Nike actually did sponsor this, this was probably made at some sweatshop by slave labor in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that's the funniest thing, is like there's this preoccupation with these brands that are known for employing third world children in horrible conditions.
Hey. If it was not on a plantation in Alabama in 1852, it doesn't count as slavery.
For anyone who doesn't know, there's a serious academic argument about how chattel slavery, as practiced by the Americans in a antebellum, America, that is somehow specially terrible slavery. If you know anything about the history of slavery and how they were treated around the world, that doesn't parse out.
So, you know how modern women say, look how bad women are treated, just watch The Handmaid's Tale or read The Handmaid's Tale, not realizing it's a work of fiction. All of the view of slavery, like the black slave getting whipped by master, that's from a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Like, it's just complete propaganda.
And it was designed to be a work of propaganda. Yeah. The guy, a black scholar later wrote to the writer and said, look, there's a lot of inaccuracies in this book. And she said, well, I was trying to create like a myth for my people.
Exactly.
So it's
it was written by a white woman.
And so for not even her people. But it's a Lord of the Rings, basically. It's like...
Well, the funniest thing is, like, during the New Deal, the Federal Writers Project, they decided, there's very few people born into slavery who are still alive. We should probably interview them, get their actual firsthand account of slavery. And if you go to the Library of Congress, they actually have a disclaimer on it saying these people must have been affected by the Great Depression because they talked about slavery with too much nostalgia. Because it's all, oh, my master was so kind to me. He was the kindest man I've ever met. After we were forced off the plantations and forced to work for ourselves, my life has just been misery and tribulation since then.
No, this has been really brushed over in terms of like history, but like there wasn't a plan to free the slaves. There wasn't a plan of like how are you going to deal with this giant population. that is used to being cared for, and now, is forced out of the only way of life they've ever known. A lot of them died.
Yeah.
A lot of them ended up in cities doing, menial labor. There wasn't a plan to educate them. There wasn't a plan to bring them into the fold.
So a lot of this stuff has been airbrushed out of history, but Charles Francis Adams, who was the grandson of John Quincy Adams, he was an abolitionist as a young man, and when he was, this was like in 1913-ish, I'm estimating the year here, he gave a famous speech where he said, I supported abolition because I thought these black people just wanted to be free, but now I think it's universally recognized that slavery was bad for white people and great for blacks. This was one of the leading abolitionists, like U.S. elites.
Slavery in general stunts your society. Societies that have slaves, they typically associate hard work with slavery. And that's a poisonous thing that's a poisonous idea to be introducing.
So just if you can't tell, we are just trying to give a middle finger to every liberal arts professor out there, but they deserve it.
Guys, this is the record. Is this uncomfortable? Is this, to say that there was...
No, it's not uncomfortable.
Fair. It might be uncomfortable for some people to hear this, but we checked. This is the record. We're sorry. There's no getting around it.
It's only uncomfortable because it's uncomfortable to realize you've been lied to and propagandized.
Yeah, essentially.
Anyways, 3 of these ugly statues isn't enough. This is in Rotterdam.
Oh, God. This looks like the beginning of a World Star Hip Hop video. That's my thing, is okay, she's, again, very threatening stance. She's got her hands in her pockets.
Wearing sweatpants.
Again, another image that were I to publish would be seen as you're unfairly, you're giving a bad image of black woman.
At least she's kind of wearing a bra, unlike the one in Times Square. Those tits are sagging slightly less.
Well, the bra is a patriarchal invention.
Yeah. So enough of these statues of generic black biomass, but not enough of the ugly art, because while we've been looking at these hideous statues that have been in the news, these are far from the only hideous sculptures that are installations in the town square paid for by the taxpayer and taken advantage of by some artists who, as best as I can tell, are just on the take.
Yep. Related to the politicians in some way.
Speaking of things that should be, that in any other context would be offensive.
Yeah, if I drew this, it would be very offensive. It would be called a racist caricature.
Yeah.
But if you slap a progressive label on it and say it's meant to spark a conversation, you can get away with this.
Oh, this was during the BLM riots, so this was especially meant to start a conversation.
Well, it's again, what you can get away with if you call it progressive, like the movie Precious. I promise you, there were some very not, sub-Saharan African diaspora, money people and scriptwriters in Hollywood, doing, substances, and one of them said, okay, I bet you guys I can make a movie where a big, chubby black woman steals fried chicken. And they'll call it brilliant. It's just amazing. This is insulting. Were I part of this community, I'd be deeply insulted by this patronizing, mediocre drivel.
Yeah. Well, so what is this? This is a guy named Sanford Biggers. That name even sounds like a caricature. That sounds like
Clayton Bigsby.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say it sounds like something Dave Chappelle made up.
Yeah, exactly. Well, not that.
This is called the Oracle. It's supposed to merge African masks and European figures. In this case, the mask is from the Maasai. Now, Gavin McInnes was talking recently about how we don't see African masks in museums anymore because it's just getting too embarrassing with how mediocre the African masks are when compared to the artifacts from every other culture in the world.
You want to play to your strengths. The masks are not the strength of these people.
Well, it is the strength of these people. That's the problem.
No, the strength is mining cobalt.
Okay. But what happens after they turn 11?
Well, we've got to have a pension plan ready for these poor kids that are getting their cobalt together so we can have electric cars.
Yeah. That's the environmentalist movement needs those kids to be mining cobalt in the Congo.
Yeah. And the best part is, if we don't have like a nuclear grid, it's for nothing. It's just going to be fire up a few more coal plants to power these cars.
The fuck is this? I look at this, I'm worried about getting tetanus.
Yeah, this is a reminder to get your tetanus shot. If that was the guy's intention, then that's brilliant. The rust monsters reminded me I need to probably get my tetanus shot done.
Now, for most of these works, I've gone online and just seen the obligatory paragraph talking about starting a conversation or whatever. I didn't even feel like doing it for this one. This is in Asheville, North Carolina. It's called Passage. It's in front of City Hall. I don't know what this is supposed to mean. Does it honestly matter?
No.
No, it doesn't.
It's already rusting.
It's like this fine citizens of Asheville, North Carolina. There's beautiful architecture in the background of this, and this is just an eyesore.
I have seen piled rocks
Yeah.
that have inspired more awe in me than this freaking monstrosity.
This just looks like detritus from a construction site.
Yeah, so you know how you guys are part of the Rust Belt. Well, this is going to remind you.
Well, either that or it looks like after the towers collapsed on 9/11.
Yeah.
That kind of looks like that.
Yeah.
What else do we have?
This looks like a racist meme.
Or a testicle?
Yeah, like a kiwi with the. This looks like the kind of thing that would be like an inside racist joke for kids on like some Chan thing that they have, whatever they're on now.
Well, one thing I can say is most of these hideous statues, they are just polluting an otherwise beautiful environment. At least this is off the side of the interstate.
Yeah, this is nice garbage. There's a beautiful island in Ontario called Manitoulin Island, and they wanted to build a monument to all the young men they'd lost in the various wars. And so they put a beautiful statue right in the middle of a major road. Like there was two roads that crossed, and it was right in the middle of it. So they ended up losing more people plus the monument when they were drunk driving. And they had to eventually move it off to the side. So now it's off to this. But anyway, that's the kind of thing.
This is called Morning Sun in Carmel, Indiana. That's supposed to be a sun and not a sprouting potato, I guess?
I see nothing good here.
No.
I see this looks like something that a child made.
Yeah. Or like you're right up against the deadline, you forgot your assignment, so you draw this.
This is like capitalist symbol. Like this whatever the white, I guess, is capitalist and the red is communist, and they're going to come together. I don't know. This is upsetting. I know my brain doesn't even want to map meaning onto this. This is how horrible this is.
And it shouldn't. There is no meaning on this. Again, we're calling bullshit on all of this nonsense. If you've listened to this series since the beginning, that's what we're going to say. We are just not missing any deeper meaning. This is just a way to bilk the taxpayer for money. Yeah. That's the deepest meaning that you're going to get out of something like this.
It's a laundering scheme, just like, certain pizza places.
So this is...
Jesus Christ. This is horrible. Whoever made this should be ashamed of themselves.
Yeah, this is from our own home country. This is in Halifax. It's called Marine Venus. Which doesn't exactly look like the Venus de Milo to me.
This looks to me like a dinosaur thrown up.
This to me looks like a penis with a very unfortunate STD.
Yeah, this looks just terrifying. This is awful. Nothing good comes from this. This doesn't inspire anybody to do anything. This is just a fucking enigmatic of the dark age in art that we live in.
Yeah, whatever that is on the top, it's discharge. That's the only way to describe it. It's discharge.
Coming out of a phallus.
Yep.
All congratulations, guys.
So now we have to go to my hometown of Calgary, Alberta.
Oh, this is going to be good.
We had a mayor who, he wasn't the worst mayor, but he just couldn't say no to a single hideous art installation anywhere in the city that cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And this one may be the ugliest.
Oh, God. This is horrible.
Again, this just looks like the refuse from a construction site, from a half-finished construction site.
And it looks like a insult to like Plains Indians burial rituals.
So on that note, every single piece of modern art, whether it's painting, whether it's architecture, whether it's these horrible sculptures, I just want to find the artist and say, you owe us an apology. The sculptor who designed this actually did give an apology, but it wasn't for wasting $500,000 of the taxpayer money, because this cost $500,000. It wasn't for just the aesthetics. No, guess what he had to apologize for?
It involved the very locals.
He had to apologize for cultural appropriation.
Yeah, for anybody who doesn't know, some tribes in the plains, they didn't bury their dead. They kind of left them up on like little huts, like little platforms they built, and they put them there. And so that anyway, that's invoked that image. I guess he wasn't even intending that.
Here's the thing. I thought when he was apologizing for cultural appropriation, I thought it was like for making stuff out of chopsticks at a Chinese restaurant. Because that also looks like
this is just such a hideous thing. Like, show your work. Show me where you spent $500K.
Well,
I could get this done for $3K. My father-in-law could get this done for $800.
Yeah, how much did you spend on the materials? I don't know, I just found it.
Yeah. So it looks like, you go to a construction site.
Normally when you say, I don't understand any of this modern art, some pretentious person, if not the artist himself, will say, you just don't understand the context. Well, here's the thing. This is the best possible context you can see. Because the real context is that this is at the side of the highway as you drive into the city. That's the actual context for this.
Great.
That showing this in the proper context doesn't really help matters, I don't think.
I love not being able to see around a curve. That's always great when you're coming off a highway.
Yeah, that's enough of this bullshit. Let's continue with our regularly scheduled storyline of how art got ugly. And this is where we remind you guys that we are viewer supported. So if you want to support us, go to ko-fi.com, that's ko-fi/Radio Free History, or else subscribestar.com/radio-free-history. If you donate to one of our higher tiers, we've got a little bit of merch to send you, branded with the logo you see on the screen right now.
And if you don't have the funds right now to help out financially, hit the like button, drop, subscribe to us, anything like that. It really helps. It's small YouTubers.
Yeah. One day will be the next Joe Rogan, but that day is not today, and it won't be tomorrow.
I can't do enough drugs to be Joe Rogan.
Yeah, fair enough.
Like I can't. The guy looks like a Neanderthal now because he's on so much HGH.
I'll be honest, I can barely do enough drugs to get through this ugly art.
Amen.
This episode is going to be a little bit different than the last few in our How Art Got Ugly series. Technically it's episode 6, but really it's episode 5.5, and you'll see what I mean in a second. So to do a quick recap, we had one episode about the Renaissance in the 1500s, one episode about Joshua Reynolds and the Royal Academy from about the 1760s until the Romantic era, one episode about 19th century France from the Revolution up until the Impressionists in about the 1870s, one episode about Montmartre in the 1880s and the 1890s, and one episode about the weird avant-garde shit like the Cubists in the aughts and just before World War I. So you'll notice that we're spending more and more time talking about shorter and shorter time periods, and every episode I say that we're going to eventually get to Jackson Pollock's number 5 in 1948. Art still doesn't look like this at this point in our story.
They actually made fun of this in the guy who did Hedwig. He made a porno, and they make fun of this in the porno that he did.
Of course, yeah. It looks like certain byproducts of sex.
Well, that's what they did. They had the guy finish on it. So
I was planning on telling a crude joke, but all right, John Kramer Mitchell, you've
beat us to the punch, my friend.
All right. So yeah, we still haven't gotten quite to this point. Art's starting to look, with the Cubists and stuff, it's starting to look a little bit weirder. It's starting to, dare I say it, look a little bit uglier, but we're still 30 years away from this, and we're not here yet. And let alone getting to like Andy Warhol, weird pictures of soup cans or whatever the fuck he does.
Well, ending with freaking Shia LaBeouf losing his mind.
Even Shia LaBeouf is doing weird modern conceptual art stuff. After about Pollock in the 50s and Warhol in the 60s, you just don't seem to have any real iconic artists anymore. Like, you seem to notice that whole storyline just runs out of steam at some point. You know, we are trying to culture ourselves so that we can have a discussion with some pretentious boomer who went to university in the 70s when it actually meant something. And any boomer with an art history degree, it seems like they're impressed by art from about Vincent van Gogh in Paris in the 1880s up until Andy Warhol, and then after that they don't give a shit, and quite frankly nobody gives a shit after that. Like after Andy Warhol paints his pictures of Marilyn Monroe, it just seems to be all over.
Yeah. So that lesbian shoots him.
Yeah. Yep.
And he goes to
that's more interesting than any of the art that comes afterwards.
And he goes to WrestleMania. So that's the connection between.
Yeah. So just saying, after Andy Warhol, like every artist is described as important or groundbreaking in the New York Times, but like nobody actually gives a shit. Like Times readers like to pretend it's important, but nobody gives a shit.
If people gave a shit, a lesbian would shoot you. And if a lesbian's not shooting you, then you're not really inspiring the reaction that you want there.
Normally lesbians just save the violence for their wives.
Whoa, shots fired.
We just released an episode on that.
We did.
It's on our other series. It's on our Night Watch if you haven't watched any of those yet.
Yeah, you might enjoy that. It's just me telling bouncing stories from my 15-year freaking career doing that.
Not all fights involve, gigantic roided out guys. Some fights involve strung out lesbians.
Yeah, trying to keep their wives in line or whatever. Oh, God.
So, like I said, this period from 1886 to 1962 seems to be the really important part, and frankly, the art in that period doesn't seem anywhere near as impressive as like the Renaissance art that came before it. But we're 13 hours into that story. I'm not going to repeat that because you can go listen to our back episodes. But the next logical step is getting from World War I to World War II. And I wanted that to be this episode. But the thing is, there's just a lot of stuff that happens in that 20-year period. Not least being the rise of some dictators who need to find propagandists. And here's the thing about avant-garde artists, they're kind of perfect for that role.
Because a lot of them are broke.
A lot of them are broke, and they are just tapped into the zeitgeist. Like, you can do things the old way and propagandize the old money, but the old money's not going to be your foot soldiers.
You want to get the youth.
Yeah. Hitler made kind of an interesting argument. He didn't like the fact that democracy had been imposed on Germany after World War I. So he said, here's the thing about democracy. In democracy, you make the best argument. We make the best argument and use violence. We're going to win.
Yeah, and he was right.
Yeah, he was. The other big change is that before World War II, the cultural center of the world is Western Europe, and specifically Paris. After Europe is completely flattened and tens of millions of people are dead, the cultural center of the world is now New York City.
Because everybody's still alive.
Yeah. So there's almost two parallel storylines between 1918 and 1939. The New York storyline and the European storyline. So there's just a lot of shit to talk about. And instead of trying to cram it all in, this is going to be what they call in the world of television a bottle episode. This is like the Chinese restaurant episode of Seinfeld where like nothing really happens. Or the sometimes maligned Fly episode of Breaking Bad where Walt and Jesse are just trapped in the lab talking to each other for an hour. In reality, that usually means that the production staff is running out of their budget, so they need a minimalist episode.
Yep.
But it still is an opportunity to flesh things out and do some character development that would be hard to cram into the storyline when you're doing it at the normal pace. So, those bottle episodes, they're no less important to the story arc. They just don't advance it, and that's going to be this episode. Normally, we look at a bunch of this art and the personality of the artists who made it. Today, we're really just going to be looking at one piece of art, or at least the series that it belongs to. And not only that, it's by an artist that we've already talked about.
Ooh.
You'll find out in a second. Why are we doing this? Well, we live in the age of YouTube, so this is not really an age when the best of the best go to university and they're the only people who have access to the sacred knowledge about which art is and isn't important the way that, the boomers did. You can watch any art history professor's lectures and they always follow the same formula when it gets to the 20th century. Bunch of weirdo artists write manifestos, then World War I breaks out. Then afterwards you have the Dadaists and the Surrealists, and they become even weirder and start really breaking the rules. Then World War II breaks out, and, I guess Jackson Pollock starts jerking off on a canvas or whatever he does.
Whatever magic he brought. Freaking mustard stain looking.
When the art history profs talk about this stuff, they maybe make a few mentions of things like new objectivity or regionalism, which are going on. But in general, you can use the N-word. And you know what the N-word is?
I don't think I should say it. But...
Well, I'm going to say it. There is an official narrative.
Oh, thank God.
Yeah. And we're going to call it The Narrative with a capital N.
I don't like them nerds.
I am not getting banned off of YouTube. I'm not afraid to say that word. We have put so much work into this. I am not going to be Papa John here. So, according to the people who sit on the board of your local museum, this narrative is what brings us from Michelangelo to the ugly statues of black women in Times Square in one continuous unbroken thread. A bunch of upstart artists try to push the envelope, and then a few truly visionary people end up chasing aesthetics, and time goes on, and the art just keeps getting more and more daring. The problem with the narrative is that it just doesn't make sense on its face. By the 20th century, paint has gotten so cheap that anybody can buy it. And you can buy some paint, take a few night classes at the community college in Memphis, Tennessee, and if you're talented, you can make some beautiful paintings. If 20th century art was truly just the result of removing all of the guardrails and allowing for evolution to take its course, you would expect to kind of see different branches of the tree popping up in different places. You might see a place like Memphis, Tennessee take on its own unique style of painting. You might see things take its own local flavor. You might see things flowering up in a bunch of different places. It's the complete opposite.
Weird.
When only a few aristocrats could afford art, they would scour the countryside looking for a peasant boy who had some technical talent and summon him to their court. There was a Dutch style of art, there was a German style of art, a French style, an Italian style, a British style, a Russian aristocratic style. Now you go to the Modern Art Museum in North America, in South America, Europe, you see the same horseshit conceptual nonsense everywhere. It looks like detritus from a construction site, and it's always accompanied by that blurb about how this is influenced by non-Western traditions and challenges us to think differently and whatever the fuck else it says.
They're very generic.
Yeah. So, at the time when painting materials have never been cheaper to get, we seem to see a convergence. So the narrative just doesn't make sense. But more importantly, this narrative doesn't explain one thing. If you don't agree with what I said there, fine, argue with it in the comments. But here's what the narrative really doesn't explain. You have Fauvism in the aughts, which we talked about in the last episode. You have Cubism in the 1910s. You have surrealism in the 1920s. You have the melting clocks and Salvador Dali and shit. You have Jackson Pollock in the 1940s. Here's another Jackson Pollock painting, which is even worse than the last one.
Strong Bad was more artistic.
Yep. But you'll notice something. Even though we see a pattern of art breaking more and more rules as time goes on, I kind of skipped a decade. I skipped the 1930s, and the narrative doesn't explain one thing. Why is this the most iconic painting of the 1930s? This breaks the pattern completely, and it just gets yada yada'd over.
The girl looks like Amy Schumer.
Okay, don't ruin art. This is like the one good piece of art from the 20th century, and yeah. Now I'm gonna see this painting and imagine her talking about how her vagina smells like a farm animal.
And the guy looks like Cork.
So the guy was actually his dentist.
Oh,
That's like a piece of trivia that sometimes comes up, but
he looks like a dentist now that you say that.
yeah, not a farmer.
No, I trust this guy with my teeth. Looks like he knows what's up.
So, like I said, American Gothic, it doesn't fit the pattern at all, and like this painting is not an aberration. This is what paintings from the 1930s look like. The narrative is Salvador Dali paints his melting clocks, yada yada yada, the bomb gets dropped on Nagasaki, and then art looks like garbage.
That's how it was taught to me.
Here at Radio Free History, this is exactly the kind of shit that we don't abide.
No yada yada.
No, we've got to get right to the bottom of this. So we're going to be starting from scratch at the end of World War I, which is kind of where we last left off. We are going to build up the cultural context of the 1920s and 1930s. When you think about it, all you really hear about the 1930s is the Depression. A bunch of like starving peasants in Oliver Twist hats standing in the unemployment line.
In the Dust Bowl.
Yeah. Well, let's think about this. When you think about the 1960s, there's kind of a cultural milieu that you can place things into. Like I just made a list of famous art from the 1960s that we associate with it, like Andy Warhol, the Beatles, Hendrix, Dylan, Motown, Woodstock, The Graduate, West Side Story, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Hair, Fiddler on the Roof, Waiting for Godot. Like, it's just, you can picture the 1960s and you can picture all of this media fitting right into it.
Yeah.
This art, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's firmly grounded in a specific time and a place. And for the boomers, it's their childhood. This is the media of their childhood. Now, if all you can think about the 30s is the Dust Bowl, does that mean the 30s is lacking in culture? Well, here's my list of art, or at least culture from the 1930s. Huxley writes Brave New World.
That's a big deal.
Tolkien writes The Hobbit.
That's a huge deal.
Orwell writes Down and Out in Paris and London.
That's a great read for anybody who hasn't read it.
Batman.
Jesus.
Superman.
Okay.
The golden age of the detective novel, like Dick Tracy and shit. Gone with the Wind. King Kong, we talked about that.
Yeah, Hitler loved that movie.
Yeah. Bugs Bunny. The Wizard of Oz, like Cole Porter writes Anything Goes. And most importantly, Mickey Mouse becomes popular, and Walt Disney makes his first feature-length film, Snow White, in 1937.
Speaking of Hitler.
Call that a Venn diagram. Add Henry Ford. So, like, all of this media is still ubiquitous in our culture, but to me, all this stuff kind of seems free-floating. It doesn't seem to be rooted in the 1930s.
Yeah.
Like, it's just me, but it seems like...
I never put this in context. Before you said that it was from the 30s, I thought it was from like the 1900s.
Yeah, exactly.
Or like turn of the century.
Yeah. Well, it just, you know it's something that's been around forever, but like, The Great Gatsby is very clearly from the 20s. It's from the Jazz Age. Like, all of this media is from the 30s, but we don't have a cultural context of the 1930s. And that just seems weird, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, can you think of any culture that you associate with the Depression? Like, the only thing I can think of is like the Grapes of Wrath, Steinbeck.
Newsies? I don't know. very
Yeah, I'm not even sure if that's from the 30s or
I
not.
don't think it is. I think I said the wrong, miserable people trying to organize. I think there's been a few plays or movies about like trying to form a union in the 30s. Something's been airbrushed here.
Something has been airbrushed, and it's the 1930s. So that's another clue. But it's actually not even the biggest clue. So a few things are wrong with the narrative. Why is American Gothic the most famous painting in the 1930s? And why is the decade that gave us Superman and Mickey Mouse and The Hobbit just a decade we seem to know nothing about other than like a few economic numbers?
Yeah, it's weird. It's really strange looking back on it.
Here's the biggest clue. When you study the narrative and you think about it, there is one glitch in the matrix that you just can't get around when it comes to the official story of art. There is one work of art which always gets mentioned because it has to get mentioned because the narrative is all about this Jackson Pollock shit. And the work I'm talking about is the first real precursor to Pollock's work. It fits so awkwardly into the narrative that it is almost always shown out of chronological order. And I was having trouble fitting this one work of art in myself. I was like agonizing over writing this script that takes us from World War I to World War II that properly and chronologically builds up the context. And I kept running into this one work of art that just always seemed so out of place that I just couldn't figure out how to make the episode flow without having to, make a really weird, left turn or trying to shoehorn it in a place that just awkwardly fit.
Weird tangent or something.
So this episode is going to be like Glengarry Glen Ross, where the setting is very confined, but there's a fuck ton of offstage action that gets mentioned, where we're just building up the proper context for everything on stage. We are going to just really only look at one work of art, and by doing it, we will have to build up so much context that in the next episode, it'll be smooth sailing when we continue on where we left off and start talking about Dada and Surrealism and Bauhaus and the Russian constructivists. So, what work am I talking about? This one here, The Water Lilies by Monet. Or more specifically, The Water Lilies was a series of something like 250 paintings that he did when he was old.
Jesus.
But this is called Les Grandes Décorations. It's 8 of these water lily murals at the Orangerie in Paris. It's like an old greenhouse that they turned into a museum just to house these. Well, originally it was to house these paintings. Now, those of you who've been paying attention will note that I did not talk about Monet in the last episode, which was more than 2 hours long. And I didn't talk about Monet in the episode before that, which was 3.5 hours long, because I'm long-winded, I guess. We have to go back 3 episodes to hear me talking about Monet, because he was one of the Impressionists. For all of this talk about the narrative and art developing from one movement to the next, it just runs into one problem. It all takes place over just a few decades, to the point that the old-timers, even the old-time avant-garde artists, they're not dead yet. In fact, they're still just chugging away in the background, working with the same art dealers and the same galleries and the same clients. It's kind of hard to tell the story of art as a moving wavefront when, like, all of the artists who we talked about 3 episodes ago, some of them are still alive and still making stuff.
The relevance of the attention economy,
exactly. I guess. Yeah, no, right now, you talk to Zoomers about the influencer they were following 6 months ago, and they're like, why? That person's old news.
Yeah.
Like, Monet is still alive in the background and still making art. In fact, up until the 1930s, forget the avant-garde stuff, up until the 1930s, the auction houses were still selling the academic stuff.
Jesus.
So when you listen to these lectures or documentaries that follow the narrative, the water lilies, which are from the 1920s, they're either kind of pinned on as a footnote to Monet's life story, which would have been 3 episodes ago, or else they're mentioned as the precursor to the abstract expressionists, one of whom was Jackson Pollock in the 1950s, so you have to shoehorn it in there. But this is from the 1920s. If we're trying to tell this chronologically, we have to talk about this in the 1920s. It doesn't fit anywhere else. Fortunately, we just don't care about the narrative. We've reached the 1920s in our story. We are going to dig into this one work and we're going to study the world it was made in. We are not just going to say, yeah, 40 years after Monet was famous, he came back for one last hurrah. The kind of like, I don't know, Quentin Tarantino, he dug up that 85-year-old Italian guy who wrote the music for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly when Tarantino wanted to do his Western movie. Yeah, I just imagine Tarantino doing coke. Bring me the old Italian guy.
Yeah.
It's just...
Probably had to bring him like several. Like, no, that's the wrong one. The other old Italian guy. I'm up over here and then some feet.
You know, say what you will about Harvey Weinstein. Without a guy like Harvey Weinstein, how do you get a guy like Quentin Tarantino, a guy who's a self-taught filmmaker?
There's nothing like artists are going to be a bunch of unrepentant hedonistic perverts.
Yeah.
You have to accept that and move on.
Yeah. It's taken us like 6 episodes to describe how art got terrible. How did cinema get terrible? Well, we threw Harvey Weinstein in jail. Period. End of story. That's the shortest podcast ever. So...
I don't want to say. What was the last good movie that came out since he went away? Anything?
No.
No, exactly. No. I'm sorry.
It was already pushing it when he was still a free man. Anyways, let's have a brief review of who Monet was in case you don't want to go back 3 episodes. In 1863, there were so many paintings rejected for the official Paris Salon that Emperor Napoleon III had ordered that this year there's going to be a Salon de Refusés, a salon of rejections.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Yeah. And, well, if you remember, the most famous entry in that Salon of Rejections, the Salon de Refusés, was this one here, Monet's Luncheon on the Grass. Now, when we looked at this, I said this painting is sometimes considered the first work of modern art. Now, that definition is so loose that there's a lot of paintings that you could potentially call that. You know, usually the earliest possible painting is Goya's The 2nd of May. That's the one where Napoleon's troops are replaced with a bunch of Arabs.
Oh, okay.
We looked at that one as well. Like usually the latest possible example of where modern art starts is something by Cézanne, where all the perspective lines were messed up. But this painting's a decent candidate because if you follow the rules of perspective, that woman in the background should be 12 feet tall.
Mm.
Like, you don't notice it at first, but then you realize she's just much too big for a woman for a woman bathing in the background.
Mm.
So, like, Monet, he was an academician. Again, I'm talking about Monet, not Monet. He was an academician. He was part of the last generation where you basically had to join the academy and work through the salon system if painting was going to be a viable career. But the upcoming generation, they were growing up in an industrializing world where paint is getting cheaper, and there were enough nouveau riche people that you could sell your work outside of the salons if you had hustle. Mm-hmm. So Monet was part of the system, but he became a sort of mentor to these young independent artists who spend their days at a cafe called Café Gerbois, and one of them is the young Claude Monet. Again, not Monet, Monet. The Franco-Prussian War broke out. Monet fled to London. He saw Turner's landscape paintings, which had been decades old at this point, but they were kind of impressionist before the word impressionism existed. again, go back like 5 episodes if you want to see that. But Turner was a member of the Royal Academy, and he did his paintings, meticulously in the studio on the gigantic easels. Monet, he lived in the new world of the paint tube and the portable easel and the flat paintbrush, and the nouveau riche professionals who were willing to buy a small painting as opposed to a gigantic mural-sized one. Monet could take his easel and paint tubes out to the park, paint a scene that was, not as meticulous in its detail, but, he could do it in a day and then put a price tag on it. So the war ends, the band gets back together in Paris. When I say the band, I mean the Café Gerbois people, minus one of them, Basile, who had died in the Franco-Prussian War. And in 1874, they decide to have their first exhibition, completely independently of the Salon exhibition. And it's a flop. Mm-hmm. But one thing comes out of it. If you look at this painting on the screen right now, there was an art critic named Louis Leroy. He showed up and he made all sorts of disparaging comments. For example, he at one point said, "I have seen wallpaper that looks more finished."
Jesus Christ.
Paris gonna Paris.
I literally got shoved.
Really?
Yeah. I was like, "Where's the bathroom?" And then I went the wrong way to the bathroom, and the lady shoved me towards the correct bathroom. I was like, okay, you've heard of pushy French people, but Jesus Christ. Anyway.
Yeah, you are not in Canada anymore. We are not polite here.
Do not try to speak that vulgar dialect of French.
So, this art critic, Louis Leroy, he pejoratively calls the painters impressionists, and the name sticks. And that name comes from this painting, which is called Impression Sunrise by Monet, which is somewhat ironically not really an Impressionist painting. When you think of Impressionism, you think of vibrant colors and broad brush strokes. That's not really what's going on here. Normally an Impressionist work is made wet on wet without much mixing to keep the colors vibrant, but this is just done on a gray background with multiple washes of color, so it's considerably less vibrant than an Impressionist work might be. And color theory is also relatively new. I mean, when we were 9 years old in elementary school art class, they had the color wheels. That was still a relatively new idea at this point. It's kind of weird to think of serious artists discovering that blue and orange are contrasting colors, but that idea had to start somewhere. But you'll notice that there's really only 2 colors here. There's blue and orange, which are mixed to produce browns, and while it's not a hard and fast rule, Impressionists tended not to use black and gray, but there's some black and gray used here as well.
Very shadowy, smoky.
Yep. Now, the funny thing, though, is just on the subject of contrasting colors, that sun is obviously what catches your eye here. It seems like it's brighter than the rest of the painting, but actually when you look at the painting in black and white, it's no brighter than anything else. That's kind of an interesting just thing to note about this painting.
How our eye privileges color.
Yep. Again, it's just when you're in grade 3 and your teacher makes you use finger paints, there's usually a color wheel on the wall somewhere, but it was a completely new idea, and these were serious artists back then. So, Leroy, when he looks at this painting, which is called Impression Sunrise, he says, "I agree it is an impression of a sunrise because you did not put in enough effort to make it actually look like one."
Jesus. Oh, he's cold.
So the Impressionists, this was their first show in 1874. They have 8 shows between 1874 and 1886, one art dealer, Paul Durand-Ruel. He really becomes their champion, and he has a lot of success selling their stuff in America. So just here's a few of Monet's works. This is more typical of the Impressionist style. Again, we went over this a couple episodes ago. The one in the bottom left I actually quite like, with like the turquoise color in the water. Yeah, this is what you really think of when you think of Impressionism. Impressionism never really ends, but by the last show in 1886, most of the big names are just moving on to other things, like to the point where Seurat's A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte, the Ferris Bueller painting, which we've talked about a couple times. It's the centerpiece of the last Impressionist show, but it's not really Impressionism at all. For a group that the narrative calls revolutionary, because every time you hear an art history lecture about the Impressionists, oh, these were radicals and they revolutionized the arts, they don't sound like a bunch of revolutionaries. Renoir, he moved in the direction of painting things that were more traditional after the run of the Impressionists was over. Degas, the guy who did the paintings of the ballerinas, he basically retired. And Pissarro, he hopped on board with the next avant-garde movement, which happened to be pointillism. He was the Jewish merchant's kid who seemed to know everybody in Montmartre. Again, I'm not going to rehash everything. Go back and listen to a couple of episodes. But Monet, he didn't change at all. This wasn't something he was doing to be revolutionary. He just liked painting like this. And he had made enough money doing it that he'd moved out to a cottage in the countryside in the village of Giverny. And he just kept doing naturescapes. And for the most iconic member of this revolutionary movement, he just spent his life chugging along doing the same thing. And he's making the same kind of paintings in 1885 that he did in 1865 and that he will in 1905 and in 1925. He's found enough financial success to be able to pay 8 gardeners to come in and tend his property, and that garden is going to be the inspiration for his water lily paintings. But let's hold that thought for now, because we need to put things in a little bit more context. So we started the whole series by asking, what the hell is art? And the first thing we realized is that that's not an easy question to answer. You know, a housewife takes a painting class and produces a really nice watercolor painting. It can be an absolutely beautiful painting, and this housewife can be really talented, but nobody is hanging that in Chicago's Museum of Contemporary Art. In fact, it's probably more aesthetically pleasing than the stuff they actually do hang in Chicago's Museum of Contemporary Art.
Absolutely.
Again, when you go to the fancy museum, you see the detritus from the construction site. You see something that looks like a turd blossom half the time.
It's like a Pokemon that was like too pornographic to be in the Pokemon.
Yeah, that's a good that's a good way to put it. And again, the blurb that talks about it challenges us. Well, I agree, you are certainly mentally challenged. Mm-hmm. Deep down, we know it's bullshit, but none of us can really say why it's bullshit, because what is art? So that was just what we spent 2 whole episodes getting to the bottom of. There was a time when like 9% of the population went to college and university, and a subset of them took a humanities degree, and they were told the narrative, the official art history story that only cultured people know. These are the people who just feel sorry for Philistines like you and me, who just don't understand why it's profound that Andy Warhol was painting his Campbell's soup cans. Like, we don't live in that time anymore. We live in an age where every truly mediocre person has a humanities degree. And again, we live in the age of the YouTube University lecture. We can figure out whether the soup cans are profound or just bullshit. They're bullshit. Spoiler alert. Look, we've been walking through the official narrative, and we just reached the point where Marcel Duchamp turned a urinal on its side, signed it R. Mutt, titled it The Fountain, and submitted it to an unjuried show. This is where every art history professor makes a grandiose statement about how Duchamp challenged us to ask, hey, can anything truly be art? Or did Duchamp really challenge us to ask that? Because from my point of view, this is like a 13-year-old kid trying to lawyer his parents after he was caught breaking a rule.
Yeah, this is like, if that's art, then everything's art.
He's just trying to say, you know, you failed to properly define the word art, and now you're just acting clever because this nebulous concept allows you to stick a toilet in an art gallery. Congratulations. It just doesn't sound terribly profound to me. I don't know.
If you're not familiar with like rich person drama and bullshit, it sounds very profound. If you've had any dealings with like, you know, even the hinterland of the ruling class, you know, these just a lot of dumb drama bullshit. Like,
yeah, but you know what? Again, I don't think you fooled anyone, but that doesn't stop the banker's wife on the museum board from scoffing at the unsophisticated trolls who think that Michelangelo's David is art, but a banana duct taped to a wall is not.
I've seen more artistic things done by TJ Kirk with a banana.
Look that up or don't look that up.
Don't look that up, guys. Just don't. You're living a good life if you don't know that. If you don't get that reference, you're like, congratulations, you're living a great
Here's the thing, just seeing TJ's face is enough to...
Homie's got a face for radio, God bless him. But he was like the head of the Ugly Guys Union. Like the head of the unlikable Ugly Guys Union on early YouTube. Like that's it.
Anyways, so in our investigation, we've seen that if you took a time machine back to the Renaissance and you talked about art, nobody would know what the fuck you were talking about. You could talk about the art of making bronzeware or the art of carpentry, but like Michelangelo and Leonardo, they were painters or sculptors, or at the most, they were craftsmen. Like our notion of art comes from Vasari, who wrote a book with a grand meta-narrative about the great painters, sculptors, and architects of the preceding 200 years, and about how their fame is going to come from these great works that are going to outlive them. And you know, there was kind of an intellectual aspect to their craft, or at least that's the argument that Vasari was making. And even though Vasari didn't use the word art, this is the idea that I think we now call art that he was describing in this book. The picture in the middle was an illustration from the book. The one on the left is actually, I think, from his house. You'll notice on the top there is a goddess holding a trumpet. That is supposed to be the goddess of fame. And then beneath the goddess of fame, you have the goddess of the various arts. In the book, it was the arts of painting, sculpture, and architecture. But in the room, I think there's a muse of literature. I can't remember what exactly it is. But beneath those goddesses of the arts, you have a bunch of dead artists who are being revived. So that the message here is that, you know, a really good carpenter, his fame isn't going to last through the ages after he's dead. He may be locally famous for making the best cabinets in town, but it's only a really good painter, a really good sculptor, or a really good architect whose works are going to last through the ages and really outlive him. There was another notion, though, and that notion was the liberal arts, you know, things like philosophy and medicine, aesthetics, rhetoric, etc. And in Georgian England, we talked about Joshua Reynolds, who had leveraged his career as a portrait art painter. And he was able to schmooze his way into high society, and he got appointed the first head of the Royal Academy, insisting that I was not just a well-read tradesman. He insisted that good painters and sculptors belong in the world of the liberal arts, though, interestingly enough, he said not engravers, much to the consternation of William Blake, was one of his most famous students. Oh yeah, again, just you want to talk about just high society people being petty about each other, especially when creativity is involved. There you go.
And the drama having huge fallout.
Yep.
Like, just much more consequence when you can write checks for stuff.
Reynolds made a series of lectures called The Discourses on Art, and this is really the origin story of that word art, which separates the guy drawing caricatures on the beach from the guy who is culturally relevant, whatever cultural relevance even means.
Especially back then.
Yeah. So the French, they already kind of had a notion of les beaux-arts, or the fine arts, but that didn't necessarily have the same connotation as what Reynolds was talking about. Like, Reynolds was talking about painting as being on the same level as philosophy.
Okay.
Even the official academy in France wasn't called the Academy of Fine Arts, even though they did have the word. It wasn't called that until after the fall of Napoleon, when the Academy of Painters and Sculptors merged with the Academy of Music. So even up until after Napoleon, at least in France, they still called it painting and sculpting. They didn't really call it art. I mean, they did, but
It didn't have the same connotation.
yeah, I think that if there's one point I'm really trying to hammer home with this, is that this concept of art is a very English language idea. If you could take a time machine back to Florence in the year 1500, you'd say, go show me the artists. They'd, what the fuck are you talking about? The artisans? Go to the marketplace for that.
This is the part of the story that blew my mind.
Yeah.
Is that this is not a universal concept.
No, not even close to it.
And it's not an ancient concept.
No.
It's relatively recent.
So every talented painter had flocked to Paris since really the days of Louis XIV. But
it's like the LA.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
Okay.
But like I said, it wasn't necessarily something higher and more abstract until Reynolds writes and delivers his discourses. And as society industrialized and as paint became cheaper, and as there was enough new money for creatives with hustle to sell on the side, you kind of saw a new breed of artist. But even then, when Monet and the rest of the Impressionists had their first show in 1874, it was under the banner of La Société Anonyme des Artistes Peintres, Sculpteurs, Graveurs, etc. I know I butchered the French, but you'll have to deal with that. It literally means the Anonymous Society of Artistic Painters, Sculptors, Engravers, etc. And yes, that does contain the word artistic, but like it's an adjective, it's modifying the word painter. It's used the same way as when you distinguish artistic gymnastics from rhythmic gymnastics in the Olympics. You know, even these people, these impressionists who supposedly changed the face of art, according to the narrative, they still thought of themselves as painters and sculptors. Even they did at this late date. You know, they were just really using the word art to distinguish themselves as the tradesman who paints your house.
Yeah.
So when you look at the timeline, there's really only 40 years between a critic pejoratively calling Monet's painting impressionist and Duchamp sticking a urinal in an art gallery. And the narrative just cannot stop talking about the importance of the Impressionists in the development of art. And yet, before Monet has hung up his paintbrush, art has gone from like an adjective, the artistic painters, to being the center of a semantic debate over whether or not a toilet or any other found object is art.
It's amazing.
So that is supposedly a good enough justification to say that now, more than 100 years later, some monstrosity is actually art because it challenges traditional standards? Yeah, no. I'm calling bullshit on this. Like, all because some people played fast and loose with the definition of an abstract noun. No, bullshit. Like, I don't know what we're going to do about this. Maybe we just need to retire this word art entirely.
Or have a dissenting opinion of what art is.
Yeah. So there is something wrong with the narrative, and we need to find out what, because the narrative, it doesn't really make sense. The more we examine it, the more glitches we find in the matrix. But this word, this narrative, is used to give a veneer of respectability to, quite frankly, a lot of nonsense. Like talking about non-traditional standards of beauty, that should be looked at with the same suspicion as healthy at any size.
Oh god, we got to do a healthy at any size at some point.
Like, here's the thing: if you follow the advice of a fat acceptance activist, all you have in store is a shortened lifespan and a quality of life that's going to be weighed down as much as your knees are.
It's not great, carrying extra weight. It sucks.
Yeah.
There's a cure for it now from the apparently.
The Ozempic?
Apparently there's a cure. So we might be the last fat generation.
All
We'll
right.
see. But yeah, it's going to be something like, imagine if this Ozempic cures it, and then we have to go back and explain why we were like rooting for this disease that was killing us. Like, I don't know. And I say that as somebody who like needs a 2XL t-shirt. So like, don't get this thing. I'm one of you. Don't worry. I clearly am not.
You're not my 600-pound life. You're good.
I'm not, but like clearly I'm not saying no to a cookie. Mm-hmm. But like you can tell that I like workout.
Yeah.
But like.
Well, I'm just saying that, if you listen to an art critic talking about what's beautiful or profound, all I'm saying is it's going to do the same thing to your soul as listening to a fat acceptance activist is going to do to your knees. Yeah, that's all I'm saying.
Well, and thank God I listened to my doctor and not the fat acceptance crowd. Like I was a time in my life where I will take a little break from art. I was around a lot of buffet tables and there wasn't a lot of action in to the end of my bouncing career because I was doing higher end gigs. And a lot of these gigs were to like, to speaking of art, were to like, high-end steakhouses, and they would see this like big fat bouncer coming in and they want like my approval. All these chefs, like if I, they clearly, it's like, this guy's serious about eating. I want you. So I make friends with them, and like I had like I could describe in detail like what they did, how I like, I knew I had like a middle class command of like culinary language. So I was like best friends. So I was literally going into work for shifts and getting fed like 3,000 calorie meals for free, just like. Because the chefs liked me and they wanted like my approval as a large person. This is the problem that compounds. So
you know who else does that? Drug dealers.
Yeah, seriously. But
and pimps.
And pimps, yeah, that's right. But I got big, and and I changed jobs and changed lifestyles, and I'm still big, but my knees don't hurt as much. So anyway, take these comments with a grain of salt.
Yeah, well, just all I'm saying, just the last word on this is just if any fucking critic or curator or docent or professor or gallery owner or whatever the fuck tells you that a Damien Hirst work is profound, he was the guy who embalmed a shark, and if anybody tells you that guy's work is profound, just like, again, imagine a 400-pound person telling you that she's actually healthy. Then she dies at 34. That's all I'm saying. So what is art? Again, we see an idea that starts with Vasari in the 1560s and then is formalized by Joshua Reynolds in the 1760s and is then taken very seriously, at least in Britain. The idea is then taken kind of seriously in France, but more loosely applied. But whatever art is, it's institutional. Aristocrats in the old days were commissioning portraits and busts, and the church and state, they were commissioning large works, but that was always just painting and sculpture. but this word art represents something more, I don't know, ethereal, maybe for lack of a better word.
Almost a spiritual term.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, something higher. Yeah.
Faith, like something that really doesn't have a proper definition. It's just a word for, you know, something that potentially predates language. You know, some part of our brain or something we just can't verbalize for whatever reason.
Yep. Yeah, it's a good way of putting it. I just
like I know
like beauty just resonates with you somehow.
Yeah, it's just I know it when I see it. It's the most ignorant thing I could say, but I feel like, you know, when I'm looking at art that really connects with me or is beautiful, I feel like there's something intrinsically inspiring. There's something intrinsically good about it.
Yep. But yeah, like I said, now this word art, and it represents something higher or faithful or spiritual or whatever word you want to use. But at least within the halls of the British Royal Academy, it's not controversial. You know, art is what we do, and what we do is art.
Mm.
But now that painting and sculpture are done outside of these institutions, once again, art becomes hard to pin down.
Yep.
There certainly is a concept of aesthetics, and one would think that this concept of aesthetics is intimately connected with the concept of art. But the second that there's any ambiguity, a bunch of charlatans and pedantic people, they just move right in and they say, well, actually, this art can have the aesthetic quality of a puddle of vomit. Like, the second that there's any ambiguity, the creatives come in and start trying to lawyer your definitions.
There's a class of people that's just what they do.
Yep.
A lot of them got into Canada on student visas recently.
Oh, it's going to be difficult to get rid of them.
That's going to be hard.
So, this concept of art clearly seems to have changed somewhere along this chain of events, especially from the Impressionists to Duchamp's toilet. And if we are looking for suspects, it is not hard to make a first guess. Because in our last episode, we looked at all of these new avant-garde movements that are popping up in every major city across Europe. I mean, not every major city, like in London and Vienna and Paris and Berlin and Milan and a couple of them. Still not that many of them. And most of these movements are accompanied by that favorite artifact of the 115 IQ crowd, the manifesto.
They were trying to make a point.
Yeah.
It's when art gets bad, usually.
Now, the average manifesto is a document saying that all art up to this point is garbage, and from now on we're doing something new.
Yeah, you're going to see this resonate through everything. You know, this is where that concept of manifesto gets ingrained in the culture, where you might see manifestos now. Explaining what are essentially American performance art pieces at this point.
Solanas, who was the woman who shot Warhol, what was her play called?
Yeah, it was just, what was it called?
The Scum Manifesto.
Oh, no, yeah, she wrote a manifesto.
Yeah.
Yeah, she did it. Oh, God. And it's sometimes used as a text in women's studies programs, and it's a really very upsetting document. By a very troubled person. Yeah. I'm not sure, the value in reading that, but anyway.
Because normally women's studies degrees have so much intrinsic value.
Well, it was just, she was like a prostitute.
Yeah.
Like she was she had a really troubled experience, and she had this kind of like tough girl persona in the city, and she's a very troubled con artist, and she eventually was delusional enough to think Andy.
So again, look at, I think it's our 5th Night Watch episode, if you want to know about crazy.
I was going to say, yeah, there's some parallels there. Jesus. I didn't get shot, though.
Uh-huh.
Almost got stabbed.
So, the average manifesto, again, it's a document saying that everything up to this point is garbage, and from now on we're doing something new, and it usually contains some sort of rhetoric about either transforming man or transforming the world or radically rethinking some idea like beauty or truth or taste or whatever. And of course, every single one of these manifestos has to take a dig at the ever-present Emmanuel Goldstein of every avant-garde community, the bourgeoisie.
Yeah, the guy's funding them.
Yeah, exactly. Well, nobody can even define what the bourgeoisie is, yet they all hate the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie are undermining everything that they're doing.
It's rich people, but somehow not like rich people related to me.
Yeah.
That's usually what it boils down to.
It's like you said, it's the rich people 3 blocks away from me who I have to live near because nobody else is going to buy my shit.
The kids who had the much more expensive bar mitzvahs.
So, you know, for a group of radical thinkers, I just want to say there's relatively little variance or bandwidth on acceptable thought about the bourgeoisie, whatever the bourgeoisie are.
When was the last time somebody was like, man, the bourgeoisie are awesome. They're, you know, providing jobs and innovating.
Anyways, until the age of Van Gogh and Cézanne, there was this idea of art in Paris that was not always well defined, but everybody knew what it was. At least intuitively, everybody knew what it was. You know, everybody knew that it happened in the learned society of the Académie des Beaux-Arts, the Academy of Fine Arts. But then in the 1890s, you had enough of a market for the creative types to start doing things outside the academies. And then every one of these independent groups had to have a document decrying the academies. And it, yeah, I know.
Fart in your general direction, academies.
If you can find enough customers to not have to go to the academy, like, that's fuck you money, or at least.
Yeah, look at us not starving.
Just saying, it wasn't good enough to say that you thought Bouguereau was an asshole, and Bouguereau was just the most famous academic painter of the day, who, again, magically is just airbrushed out of the narrative.
Yep.
In the last episode, or maybe it was 2 episodes, we looked at like art publications from Paris at the turn of the century, and they were all talking about this guy being the most important artist. Yeah, he's gone. I'd never heard of Bouguereau. Had you?
Like River Phoenix.
Yep. Oh.
Thank God they didn't have speedballs back then. At least they hadn't figured that out.
Yeah, imagine Vincent Van Gogh.
Yeah, I would have loved the speedball. Van Gogh would have loved the meth. When I do the outsider art episode, it'll be like, one thing I want to drive home is like the difference between like the concept of a troubled artist and the reality of like a deeply mentally ill person in your life that you have to care for.
Look, okay, we all think, oh, it's such a tragedy that Chris Farley did a whole bunch of drugs and put himself into an early grave. Chris Farley wouldn't have been famous if he hadn't done that many drugs.
He was running the engine in red. He was running the engine to the maximum capability that it could go.
Yeah. Do you think he was sober for a second on SNL? No, he wasn't.
No. And Belushi, same thing.
Anyways, like it wasn't good enough to say you thought Bouguereau was an asshole. You had to come up with this pretentious document talking about how just this whole enterprise is nonsense. And art is kind of retroactively defined as that whole enterprise that they're trying to decry as nonsense. So, you know, they're trying to do away with this old stuff in favor of something more modern, something more enlightened, and something that's going to radically change society. And like, to be clear, there's never an exact moment when this happens, but even then at this point, when you're reading fancy publications, they talk about paintings. You know, when you read the manifestos that get ever crazier, that's when they really start talking about art. This liberal art, the one that was created by Joshua Reynolds, now it's kind of being crammed into a box of its own making by actors who are hostile to the Academy. And once that happened, it's not that art immediately became ugly, but that starts to put us on the track to where it is, to where we are today.
That's when the gate got opened.
Yep, that it is. So like I said, we can't quite answer the question of how art got ugly in this episode, but now finally some of these pieces are starting to fall into place.
Leonard Cohen had something interesting to say about like art. He said, if your life is burning properly, art is the ash. Anyway.
That's why not a lot of artists were teetotal.
Yep.
So, in many ways, this is kind of the only way things could have ever gone. We think about art in the way that Vasari taught us to think about art, even if Vasari didn't have a word for it. But when Vasari told his story about Florence experiencing the Renaissance, how does the story start, if you don't remember the first episode in our series? The story starts by demonizing the old style of architecture, the kind that depends on pointed arches and ribbed vaults, which he described as barbaric and disordered and generally unsophisticated.
Unstable.
Well, again, he uses the word Gothic, and he uses that word repeatedly and pejoratively in the Lives. And this Gothic architecture is just his punching bag, as something that Pisano and Brunelleschi and the rest of the Renaissance architects had to overthrow. The turn of the century was a time when everybody in Paris sees himself as just as sophisticated and as visionary and as ready to lead humanity into a new age of the machines. And just as Vasari talks about overthrowing the Gothic aesthetic, all of these manifestos are talking about overthrowing the old way of doing art. So some people say that Vasari's Lives is really the first manifesto, but that kind of gets the causality backwards, because every manifesto was just intentionally written to be like Vasari.
Okay.
You know, again, everything up till the present was garbage, but then there was this huge enlightenment or revolution, and now we're doing things properly. So, to say the least, this shows a level of confidence bordering on hubris.
Oh, God, yeah.
Because Vasari, he was at least writing from the vantage point of the Counter-Reformation. He was writing a centuries-long retrospective of the last 200 years, going back to Giotto, teaching paintings how to cry. If you remember, we looked at that in the first episode as well. It's very different to be writing a manifesto saying this is the start of a new revolution. It's one thing to write it after the fact, but it takes a certain, chutzpah to say this is the start of a new revolution that's going to change our view of aesthetics in the way that the Renaissance did.
You're making some bold claims.
Yeah, but in many ways, it is the best insight into this level of overconfidence that got a reality check when World War I came.
Did it ever? Oh God! What do you mean we all have to die in the trenches?
What do you mean we? I don't have to die in the trenches. You have to die in the trenches. Now, to give the devil his due, though, some of this stuff in the manifestos, some of it does make sense. In the last episode, we looked at the futurists. We talked about Marinetti's Futurist Manifesto. And I have to admit that he does make some good points in that. The document, it feels surprisingly relevant to the world we live in, despite being written in 1909. I leave it to you to decide whether that means he was a visionary or if culture is just that stagnant that it hasn't moved a millimeter in the last 116 years. In the Futurist Manifesto, Marinetti, he starts with an image of a city lit up by electric lights with the phrase, "We had trampled our atavistic ennui into rich oriental rugs." In other words, we can't figure out a way to express ourselves with the current existing cultural idioms. And there's already a bit of a tension there because, yes, we can see the beauty in the works of Michelangelo, but it's not always easy to express our thoughts by saying this reminds me of Michelangelo's David. In fact, if you try to do that, it looks like the statue in Times Square.
Put you away. Should put you away.
Yeah. Now again, the counterpoint to that is that it's just as relevant as ever to make a Shakespeare reference. Most crazy women are Ophelia, and most conniving women or Lady Macbeth. So, it's just something to think about. But, that said, Marinetti does make a good point. This podcast is written to be consumed in the internet age. And even if I reject Marinetti's framework and pepper this whole thing with highbrow literary references, sometimes the best reference point is still like PewDiePie or Sargon of Akkad and Gamergate or Kanye West's choice words about the ethnic makeup of the entertainment industry.
10 years ago, when everybody was talking about uplifting minority voices, I was just thinking, like, you've never had your hair cut in a black barbershop.
No.
You would be very worried about uplifting certain minority voices. Anyway.
I remember seeing that headline when Kanye shot his mouth off for the first time, and I thought it was a joke, but then I realized it was an actual CNN link. How is this real?
It's like something on The Onion. Back when The Onion was good.
So, again, Marinetti does have a point about at least needing new cultural idioms to express ourselves, and I will give him that. But as the manifesto continues, he says he has an aha moment from the streetcars and the electric lights, and he and his friends grab their cars and start speeding around the city. And again, this may have been written in 1909, but you can just picture wealthy Eurotrash today just staying up all night philosophizing and then hopping into a Ferrari.
And driving drunk and barely missing peasants.
Yeah. So, Marinetti, he says that in this modern, comfortable world, the only way to really get into a mental state where you can be creative is to do something dangerous, like speeding the car around and getting an adrenaline rush.
Yeah, so he's not alone in that one.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, it's hard to look at like the amount of money that the Fast and the Furious movies have made and say he was wrong about that.
The rest, when you're used to adrenaline, the rest of your life kind of is on lower volume.
Yeah.
Like when I was regularly getting adrenaline dumps and stuff at work, it was just like, okay, that's much more real, and it's a much more complex experience, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
Then go look up, if anyone who's curious, look up a flow experience. If you're used to that, like the rest of the world, kind of, the rest of your life is just kind of toned down. I imagine a lot of these guys, especially after the war, or if they were just doing extreme sports or whatever stupid stuff they were doing, like you get used to that, and you can't just go back to like normal stuff. Anyway.
Well, all I'm saying is that, every movie from the 90s, it had a car chase when it wanted to up the stakes. Like, that's just how, like, ingrained and cliched this has become. And, you would think of the car chase as being something from maybe the 70s or the 80s, but no, it comes from this document in 1909.
Jesus.
Tom Cruise, he made a career out of doing more and more outlandish stunts to the point that, like, nothing seems normal in the world of the action movie, in the world of a Tom Cruise movie. But still, the image of the car racing around the city, it's just becomes so cliched that we don't even think about it.
Yeah, it's like a symbol as much as like a sunset or a sunrise.
I know.
It's like,
But that goes right back to Marinetti's manifesto in 1909. And according to Marinetti, if you want to break free of these romantic ideals or anything that demands sacrifice, just hop in a car and go joyriding until you have to be completely in the moment because you don't want to crash the car.
Jeez. This is the same thing Hell's Angels will tell you.
Well, yeah, exactly. This whole message that you get vitality for its own sake by confronting death.
Yeah.
That's a scene from Fight Club.
Yeah.
Like, that's, again, you think of Fight Club as being this really avant-garde, weird movie from the late 90s, almost a quintessential Gen X movie, but that idea wasn't a new idea either. Like you said, the biker gangs, but it may sound somewhat selfish, but there is something hardwired in us to admire the biker gang or James Dean or whoever else.
At the end of the day, humans at their highest level were taking down large mammals to eat. And I'm sure there was a thrill, and because they were always getting hurt doing this, there's all these like injuries that would be consistent with like trying to kill a large animal. But it makes sense if we evolve to kind of need that loudness.
Yep.
That adrenaline rush, and it's something that's not satisfied.
Certainly in the modern world. Marinetti's not just saying that you should risk death just to get the adrenaline rush or to feel alive. He's also saying that if you really want to be creative, the fount of creativity is found by breaking out of what he calls the horrible shell of wisdom. Like, again, he starts this by talking about sitting up reading philosophy all night, then hopping in his car. He says if you really want to get the creative juices flowing, at least he argues you need to put yourself in an extreme situation. I don't personally think he's right by saying that, but you can't deny that he was at least on to he was on to something when he talked about the image of surrendering yourself to the unknown in a mechanical society. Like, what is the Matrix's red pill, blue pill scene, if not that? That's far from the only example. You have like Deckard surrendering himself to the unknown world in Blade Runner, or even Salman Rushdie. He got a fatwa issued over the satanic verses over a book about two people being reborn after a plane crash, right?
Here they got him.
Yeah, eventually they did.
Stabbed him in the neck, poor guy.
But even more mundane movies like Office Space or American Beauty, they're just about breaking out of the soul-crushing but safe world of a fluorescent lit office.
And recapturing that adrenaline rush that we miss. Like, looking back on 15 years of bouncing, what kept me in that profession was the adrenaline and the community, the camaraderie.
The difference between a movie like Office Space and Marinetti's Manifesto, though, is that Marinetti doesn't, like, romanticize the simple life. He's the opposite. He wants to get his humanity back by making even more machines to push the human experience even farther. So I think this is where he starts to diverge from at least movies since the 80s. Like, every movie, by the 80s, you had a bunch of movies talking about the corporation being the evil people wanting to strip us of our humanity.
Well, and you had the Borg.
Yeah, exactly. At least in 1909, before World War I, Marinetti says, all right, these machines are allowing us to get an adrenaline rush. Let's get even more mechanization in society. While joyriding, he crashes the car into a ditch after some oblivious cyclist hesitates. And again, that's another Hollywood formula. The car chase ending because some oblivious bystander goes, and causes the crash. This is where it comes from.
That's how T. Lawrence died. I guess some people have to live their art.
I'm just going to say I think T.E. Lawrence got his adrenaline rush in a lot of ways that were...
Oh, you're going to learn about that, kids.
Yeah, we've got a Lawrence episode coming up as well.
He's a complicated guy. He's very complicated.
Again, the narrator in Marinetti's Manifesto, he ends up in a ditch full of industrial runoff, which to me just seems gross, but I guess that when a mechanized society is something new and novel, this feels to him like a literary image of rebirth in water. Jesus. Like that's where it starts to seem like a foreign concept to me.
It's like how Tolkien, really looked down on industrialization. Yeah. This guy's the opposite. He's
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Praising industrialization.
Well, he says that the black water of industrial runoff, he says it's like having an African nurse.
Jesus Christ. Holy shit.
Yeah, he says he was reborn into this world of the machines. So this is kind of very much the anti-Matrix message.
The homie was doing DMT, though. This is a step away from Clockwork Elves.
Well, after the car is pulled out of the ditch in the manifesto, it's completely smacked up and totaled, and it restarts. And this is where Marinetti philosophizes about how this represents how life is different in the new mechanized world.
It represents your inability to drive and your willingness to put others in danger chasing an adrenaline rush.
Yeah, it's Eurotrash.
Exactly. Yep.
So, in a line totally reminiscent of a divorced boomer's midlife crisis, he says, "We declared our high intentions to all the living." And then he proceeds to list 11 points about how all art up till now has been asleep. That's the word he uses. He uses the words being asleep.
And now it's woke?
Yep, he says the new art is going to represent a world waking up. Just
Jesus
again,
Christ.
you want to... We've been talking about for 3 episodes about how our culture's just in an auto loop.
Yeah, there's no getting around this. Guys, I'm sorry, this is the record.
Yep.
This is just where we're at. We didn't expect to find this. We didn't want to find this. This is what we found.
Forget the word woke. We found car chases back then.
Yeah.
We found car chases that end after an oblivious bystander goes,
Yep. Yeah, this is what you call a period of stagnation. There's no getting around it.
These 11 points, he talks about things like singing the love of danger. He talks about the beauty of speed. He famously says that a car is more beautiful than a sculpture. He talks about writing hymns to the man at the wheel.
Jesus Christ.
Which again, a certain generation loves people like James Dean, so...
And Henry Ford.
Well, James Dean died at the wheel,
Yeah,
though.
that's fair.
Of course, in our generation, the man at...
Henry Ford made that possible.
See, in our generation, the man who died at the wheel was, what was his name? What was the guy from Jackass?
Oh, JSDL, freaking Ryan Dunn.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, man. Sometimes, if God's going to take people, it's better he takes them in pairs. And you've seen Bam Marguerite.
Yeah, Bomber Jerry.
He's not doing well since his buddy died. So... I hope he gets sober, but it's not looking good for that guy. So his breakdown is live on social media.
I'll be surprised if any of those guys ever get off of the painkillers.
Most of them are sober, like the living ones. But I guess there's a selection bias there. Like Steve-O got off the sauce somehow.
Okay.
And yeah, that was the one that I really would have thought was not going to live long, but he pulled it together. He had a rich family. His dad's a Pepsi executive.
Sometimes you're surprised, sometimes you weren't. As a friend of mine told me once, everybody was surprised that John Lennon was the first Beatle to die. Everybody was surprised that Freddie Mercury was the first member of Queen to die. Nobody was surprised that the ODB was the first member of Wu-Tang to die. That was going to happen. So, what else does Marinetti talk about? He talks about conspicuous consumption. He talks about demolishing morality. He even talks about getting rid of feminism, because even in 1909, feminists are a bunch of self-righteous midwits who thought they were geniuses for following a rigid set of arbitrary rules.
Well, it also shows you just how old criticizing this is.
Like
this battle's been going on without gaining an inch either way for how a century at this point?
Yeah, 116 years.
There
This is 1909. It's 2025 now. Marinetti said a lot of things that feel as fresh as a daisy after 116 years, including the fact that feminists love to huff their own farts. Like, that's how much cultural stagnation we have. So the manifesto, it ends with kind of an interesting point about museums being graveyards. He says that once a year on All Saints Day, because he's Catholic, you go to the cemetery to honor the dead. But if you go to the cemetery every day, it's just going to suck the vitality out of you. So he's not saying that we should ignore the past, just that we shouldn't dwell on it.
Good advice.
So, again, of all of these manifestos, he's the Futurist Manifesto is the one that I do have some sympathy with.
Okay.
It does bring up the age-old question of tradition, though. Sure, it's easy to get rid of old traditions once they seem silly and they seem like people are just going through the motions. But once you get rid of the rituals and traditions, things just have a way of falling apart. Like, it's easy in the year 1909 to say that Italy is stuck admiring and almost fetishizing its past glory, and that this is stopping it from doing great things. So we're giving the devil his due, so even if we sympathize with them, there are still two glaring issues. The first glaring issue is that, as we're saying, sometimes culture just gets stuck. You know, you don't just look to the past for nostalgia or sentimentalism. You sometimes have to look to the past for genuine inspiration. It's the year 2025. You cannot turn on the television or Netflix without being scolded for your white privilege or seeing people kowtowing to black women, including the statues in Times Square. Or else, you know, watching some 95-pound sassy female suplexing three 250-pound men. Like, that's just what our culture is right now. Or either that, or it's seeing the 17th adaptation of some Marvel IP. Like, they're
It's also full with, like,
exactly,
you know, quote-unquote strong female characters.
Yeah. Well, there were a lot of great animated series in the late 2000s, because we're millennials, this is our vintage, and there were some good indie movies in the late 90s, and I enjoyed Seinfeld and The Sopranos, and they hold up pretty well, as do a lot of movies from the 70s. So, you know what? Hollywood may be so bad right now that I want Harvey Weinstein to get an across-the-board pardon, but at least I can go enjoy the old stuff.
What would you do for a new Tarantino film? That's really the question.
Yeah.
How far are we willing to go in terms of letting these monsters run rampant over our society just to get some decent art out of the frickin' place?
I know. So, like, that's the first glaring issue with his argument, is just the present is not always going to be a source of inspirational culture. Sometimes looking at the old Michelangelo painting is what you got to go to if you live in an age where not a lot of creativity is being produced. But the second glaring issue is that when you live in Italy in 1909 and you're talking about how technology is going to lead Italy into a new golden era of energy and vitality, you cannot give your army guns and then watch them lose a war to the Ethiopians, as they will a couple of years later.
Yeah, that was a hard L for the Italians. Like, it was to the point where, like, the Ethiopians were, like, still, like, weaving frescoes about their victories. Yeah. There's all these Ethiopian frescoes about them beating the Italians.
With spears.
Yeah. And some other weapons, but yeah, they use spears. So, I mean, the Polish use spears at this point, like, or lances. Yeah.
So, while I don't agree with every point in the founding document of the Futurists, I cannot discount the influence it had on modern culture, especially cinema. And if anything, it reveals just how derivative everything in the modern world is. Like, it's not just derivative, it's derivative from a world older than Lawrence of Arabia.
Yeah, pre-World War II.
Pre-World War I.
Yeah.
As the narrative goes, the old world was at the height of its culture, and then the continent descends into the Great War, which destroys the old aristocratic culture, and from those ashes arise Pablo Picasso and Ernest Hemingway in this enlightened 20th century world of soulless bureaucracies and democracies full of corrupt politicians who never seem to get voted out, and ugly art.
Lots of ugly art.
That's how the narrative goes. The problem with the narrative is that, like so many other common historical narratives, it falls apart when you look at the dates, because most of these famous manifestos were already written before the Archduke was shot, and the Futurists were the ones who got it the most correct when it comes to presaging the modern cultural aesthetics. But even the rest of them don't really feel dated. Like Tristan Tzara, he wrote 2 Dada manifestos during the war, which are ostensibly about tearing everything down and starting fresh. But they don't sound terribly different from any current undergraduate essay deconstructing culture and calling it bourgeois.
Not a lot of movement.
No. And like I said, the 2020s is not exactly a time of cultural flowering. Like probably the last books to enter the broader zeitgeist were the Harry Potter novels from the 90s.
Seriously.
And again, every movie since 2010 is a sequel or a comic book adaptation or the inspiring story of the one black woman who corrected a typo in a speech once.
Or a remake.
Yeah, that too. So everybody knows we're in a stuck culture, but nobody seems to agree on when it got stuck. You know, and it's special. It's hidden by the fact that the 1960s and 1970s were certainly a dynamo of movies and music production. But if you live in a city where you go to a silent movie festival, you would be surprised how well some of the old stuff holds up.
Mm.
In fact, when you become an adult, you can watch like the really old Bugs Bunny cartoons from, as I said, the 1930s, and you realize that as time has gone on, these have just become less creative, not more. Like in the old Bugs Bunny cartoons, when a character goes by a woodpile,
Jesus.
it's always a character hiding in the woodpile.
Well, it comes down to, like, again, like how much horror are we willing to let a Walt Disney, wreak to get,
So this is the year 2025, and look, I am going to argue that our culture is stuck in about 1925, and that we have not moved 1 inch in a century. It's just like the Wizard of Oz. We have had a century-long acid trip full of bright colors and midgets and furries.
Yep.
But when the trip wears off and we need to worry about actually surviving, because that day's coming soon, I don't trust people to keep the power grid up.
Not into my old age.
No.
I'm going to be really shocked. If I'm 80 and have electricity,
Yep.
I'm going to be surprised.
So when the acid trip wears off, we are going to find ourselves back in Kansas in the 1920s. That's my thesis, at least. And why the 1920s? First of all, we just don't know that much about the 1910s and 1920s, so we're kind of oblivious to the fact that we're just reliving this era on auto loop. That's part of it. Like the 20s, yeah, sure, it was the jazz age and the time of the flapper, but the 1910s, I mean, I can't name any movie set in the 1910s that wasn't either about World War I or about the spoiled rich girl cheating on her fiance with Leonardo DiCaprio before the boat sinks. Like, it kind of feels like a very different time, and yet if you read old newspaper articles from the 1910s, it doesn't feel as foreign as you might expect. You know, it still is an age with electric lights and automobiles and airplanes, long-wave radios and ocean liners and transatlantic cables.
Yeah, you already got the scaffolding for our current
Yep.
way of doing things.
Yep. In fact, like the only real period piece I know that might give you somewhat of an idea of the world in the 1910s is, have you seen the Warren Beatty movie Reds?
No.
Yeah, it's about John Reed, the prominent American communist, but the movie is largely set in Greenwich Village during the Progressive era.
Jesus.
And, you know, while the fashion is different, it doesn't feel quite as far off as a Sherlock Holmes movie, and Sherlock Holmes wasn't that long, at least it wasn't set that much farther back.
Yep.
Also, the sexual mores in Greenwich Village during the Progressive era are very similar to the sexual mores in New York during the 80s.
It seems to go back to Rome.
Yeah, some things are cyclical.
Yeah.
Like I said, if you go back just 20 years before that to the 1890s, you get the age of the gas lamps and the Victorian era and the Gilded Age, Cecil Rhodes, Teddy Roosevelt. To me, at least, that just seems like much more of a distant world to me than the age of Titanic when you had all of the technology that we have today.
Yep.
Like, for all of the changes brought about by the atomic bomb and by space travel and the transistor and all this good stuff, our modern world depends on the Panama Canal now just as much as it did in 1914 when the canal opened.
Yep. Yeah, if you can't use that, we all got to pay a lot more money to get goods.
Yep.
So that's directly hits everybody in the pocketbook.
Yeah, just think of how much more you've been paying for cheap shit from China because the Suez Canal has been closed.
Yep.
So we're gonna go back to something I talked about in the first episode. This is Casa Loma in Toronto. I showed this slide in the first episode. This picture of a dining room. This is a castle right in the middle of the city of Toronto. What's the story behind this castle? Was it some old aristocratic thing, some old landed noble in Canada from the British Empire? No, it was a rich guy who made his money off of the electric company and decided he wanted a castle, so he built a castle in the middle of the city, and then he couldn't afford the upkeep on it, so he donated it.
Yep, very Canadian story.
Yep. Casa Loma was built in 1910. And it has an aesthetic that in some ways feels dated, but yet in some ways it doesn't. Like, this was considered completely modern in 1910. It's certainly not the style now. Nobody's apartment looks like this. But I remember my dad taking me on a business trip when I was a kid, and businessmen having oak and mahogany furniture in their offices that kind of looked like this.
Yeah, it was like a sign of wealth.
Like, this is not the decor of Ebenezer Scrooge, but it is the decor of Mr. Burns from The Simpsons.
Yeah.
Like, Mr. Burns was portrayed as a feeble old man in his 90s when The Simpsons was in its golden age. And Mr. Burns was kind of a vestige of the WASP elite who lost their, hegemony in the 20th century, but Mr. Burns was not an anachronism. Casa Loma was literally built in the 1910s for the guy who made his fortune owning the electric company that lit up Toronto, and that's a guy who would have probably been Mr. Burns' peer,
Yeah.
or at the very least, he would have been a peer of Mr. Burns' parents.
Yeah, like the robber baron types.
Yeah, exactly. So that's Exhibit A in my case that we are still culturally stuck in this era. Mr. Burns, he was a caricature. He was a man who was stuck in a bygone age. But that archetype existed, and it was frozen in time because those people just didn't need to adapt.
Yeah. That makes sense.
So,
Elon Musk.
Well, Elon Musk will say he has different sexual mores from...
That he will. They're starting to parade his daughter out on social media, like as a model.
You mean his real daughter or
The
his
one that-
true
the
note?
one that became-
Okay.
The one that became his daughter.
Yeah.
Oh,
So the one who's still an autistic boy?
I don't know.
He's still an autistic
I
boy.
don't want to anger the algorithm. I live in fear.
There's a word we can use that'll trip the algorithm.
Yeah.
The algorithm, trust me, LLMs are not smart enough to determine which he and she is a misgendering and which one is just a normal pronoun.
Yeah, that's fair. Just like...
But yeah, just saying, if you read any writings from the early 20th century, you see the same theme coming up over and over and over again. It's that the world is now so mechanized that we don't quite know our place in it anymore. But the difference is that it was not some existential drama like Office Space about people feeling like a meaningless cog in the wheel. I mean, that kind of existential crisis came along in the 1930s with Brave New World and the Charlie Chaplin movie Modern Times. But in the aughts in the 1910s, when you talked about an industrialized society, it was still about this mechanized paradise where humans were going to be freed from manual labor. And that kind of gives us Exhibit B for my hypothesis that we're stuck in 1925, because well into the 20th century, you still have cultural touchstones like Tomorrowland or the Jetsons, which still tell the story of how we're finally going to achieve this industrialized utopia where people only need to work 3 hours a week.
Well, you right into Star Trek, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's all the promise of that was Gene Roddenberry's whole freaking philosophy.
And again, that's right there in 1910. So, Star Trek, the story about the future utopia was already the exact same existential questions that were being faced when this room was built. So this vision of an industrialized utopia, it took various forms throughout America and Europe, but since the 20th century played out with Europe blowing itself up and becoming a client of American hegemony, the American vision becomes the dominant one by default.
USA.
Exactly. Default. But that American vision didn't just come from nowhere. Like, it's not the monolith in 2001: A Space Odyssey where it appears to everyone, different people interpret it in different ways, but nobody knows what it really means or where it comes from. The American utopian vision comes from a very specific place. And perhaps unsurprisingly for the Americans, that place is a science fiction novel.
Yeah, the number of times, if you take it back far enough, it comes down to like some lunatic wrote a book.
Yep.
It's
Scientology.
Yep, there you go. And all kinds of other like stuff, like the Millerites.
Yep.
That was a publishing concern. Started that, man. It was still the Watchtower Publication Society for the Joe.
Oh, I didn't know that. That doesn't surprise me. That's all these crazy American religious movements were just Protestant millenarian movements which won the survivorship bias lottery.
Yep. Most came out of a specific region.
We're
going to do the various enlightenments. We'll do that one at some point. But.
So yeah, I'm just saying we want to talk about a stuck culture. Well, in 2025, superhero movie is kind of used as a shorthand for the paint-by-numbers Hollywood production with no real creative inspiration behind it.
And they've got all those properties going back 100 years.
Yep.
That, they can buy up.
Yep. I'm just saying it's only fitting that when you get down to the bottom of this rabbit hole and you hit bedrock, you find a science fiction novel, and that novel is called Looking Backward, written by Edward Bellamy. Now, Bellamy's Looking Backward was the best-selling book in its day when it was published in 1888, and not a lot of people are familiar with it now. It starts with the trope that you've seen in stories like Futurama, where the enlightened, educated New Englander, because of course he's a humble, bragging Puritan, he falls asleep and he wakes up in the year 2000 to find that the United States has become a futuristic technological society.
Jesus Christ.
So even that's not something new. Even that was 112 years old.
That makes you that much smarter for appreciating Futurama.
Yeah. I'm sure Futurama had enough eyebrow references in it. I'm sure there was a reference to this book directly in it, but I don't know. I can't tell you it off the top of my head. So this guy, he wakes up in the year 2000 to find that the United States has essentially become a gigantic corporation where everybody puts in a few hours a week at the closest factory, and there's enough productive output to give everyone advanced gadgets and a universal education and all the time in the world for whatever leisure pursuits he wanted. If that sounds awfully Soviet, that's not a coincidence.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the money that financed the Russian Revolution came from the American ruling class.
So you see the foundations being laid here for sympathies and.
Oh yeah. So that book, Looking Backward, it inspired so many Puritans to think for the 1000th time that they had found the formula to build New Jerusalem, that, like I said, they were willing to throw money at the Bolsheviks and look at the Soviet project with hearts in their eyes. And, Holodomor, great purges, who cares? Let's not let that get in the way of our utopian vision. They only really came to their senses once Uncle Stalin committed the grave sin of signing a non-aggression pact with Hitler without asking for the Americans' permission.
Jeez, yeah. That'll turn you.
If you think I'm being hyperbolic by saying that it's all driven by a single science fiction novel, consider that Alexis de Tocqueville called America a nation of social clubs. His example was that, in any other country, if you wanted to stop drinking, you would just stop drinking and get on with your life. But Tocqueville noted that Americans could somehow start a temperance society based around getting social validation out of not drinking.
Yeah, it's society of joiners.
Yeah. And not only would they do that, the Americans could actually grow a temperance society to 200,000 people.
Yep.
Like, again, Tocqueville thought this was, I'm not going to say he thought it was ridiculous, but he said there's just certain quirks that the Americans have that make you laugh. So as soon as Looking Backward came off the printing press, there were hundreds of these Bellamy clubs that pop up across America.
The Star Trek fan clubs of their day.
Basically, yeah. It's devoted to the idea of nationalizing all industry and turning the country into this science fiction novel where the country is a gigantic centralized corporation.
Okay, so Star Trek was just a rebranding of the
this idea that America has always been the land of the staunchly individualist capitalist. Oh no. That's the modern hagiography, which airbrushes a lot of stuff out of history. There's been a lot of communist sympathizing for a good 50-year period.
Especially the ruling class stuff.
Yep. Eric Fromm, he said that that book created almost immediately on its appearance a political mass movement. And just like any other pie-in-the-sky utopian idea coming out of the American intelligentsia, they couldn't manage their own finances. So the movement's central publication went bankrupt in 1894, and the movement was basically dead in 1896. And remember, the book came out in 1888, so like less than 10 years. To contextualize things a little bit, this was the golden age of, as I said, the American millenarian cult, where the charismatic Protestant leader would find an obscure passage in the scripture and say that the end was nigh. And a few of them, like the Adventists, managed to become full-blown denominations because survivorship bias.
Despite trying not to, in some cases.
And also, as I said earlier, decades later, a man named L. Ron Hubbard showed us that it's really not that far-fetched for an American science fiction writer to become a cult leader.
So, fun fact, Roddenberry hated Hubbard because they were at science fiction conventions together, and Hubbard was running his mouth and saying stuff like, if you want to get rich, you should write religion, not sci-fi. And this pissed off Roddenberry to the point where there's an episode of the original Star Trek series that is like bashing Hubbard and like Scientology. It's called The Key. It's where they come, and there's like a guy who looks suspiciously like L. Ron Hubbard. And the children of this society have risen up and like he's convinced them to kill their parents.
Creatives are taking passive-aggressive swipes at each other in their work? When did this start?
But they were contemporaries. So to give you an idea of like, what Roddenberry could have done had he been malicious.
Yeah.
Just...
And less heterosexual.
Yeah. Well, there are cross-dressers in the first season of TNG. He insisted on putting cross-dressers in the background.
Good for him.
He was ideologically consistent, and then season 2 came around, they were like, okay, you made your point. And they were able to reduce the number of cross-dressers. But anyway, Star Trek, man.
So, and just I'm saying, Bellamy's movement disappeared, but the idea of nationalizing the industry had now entered the American lexicon to the point where, publications of the age, they would regularly use phrases like, as optimistic as Edward Bellamy.
Jesus.
It's funny, when you start learning this stuff and you start reading these old texts, that's a phrase that would have just gone over my head.
I love how the communist ideals are built on like mass industrialization, and the places that actually spawned communist governments were like, these non-industrialized like Russia and China. And,
yeah, we're going to have to do an episode on communism in America. In fact, we'll probably have to build some of that cultural context in the next couple of episodes when we talk about the 30s.
Well, I got to do Stalin, speaking of this period, so Stalin's episode's coming.
So, yeah, so just the idea of the utopian society where everybody's a cog in the machine. Like I said, it had its detractors, but just like now, if you didn't believe in the elites and the intellectuals' stupid utopian ideas, you know what that meant? It meant that you were the Philistine who just didn't get it.
You're a sinner. Yeah. You're a dirty sinner.
Like I said, it would have to wait another 50 years before Orwell was so disillusioned that he wrote in 1984 saying, yeah, I used to be one of these idiots, and this is what the world is going to look like if they ever get their way. And to this day, a lot of intellectuals still haven't forgiven Orwell for breaking rank.
No, the amount I've known communists that hate Orwell, and I've known like authoritarians, right-wing authoritarians that hate Orwell.
Yep.
So he did something right.
Yep.
It's banned in like every country where you're not allowed to think, basically. So.
Oh yeah, when they started flooding our high school curriculums with feminist garbage like Margaret Atwood, the first thing they removed was 1984.
I was the year in my school where they pulled 1984, which was one of my favorite books, and they put Handmaid's Tale in its place.
Yep.
Because CanCon. And I felt robbed, and I've always felt robbed, and I've always harbored a dislike of Margaret Atwood ever since.
Well, they blackballed Orson Scott Card because he had the audacity to give the Handmaid's Tale a bad review.
Yep, and it deserved a bad review. It's an awful book.
And he said, when I finally got to meet Margaret Atwood, I realized she wasn't just a horrible writer, she was also a horrible person.
I did security for the PWAC Guild, and Atwood I think I did it 5 or 6 times because I was running security for the venue they had it at. But like Margaret, I think showed up only once in the 6 years, and it's like she lived like down the street from this venue, and like she looked at me like she gave me the most pitiable look, like, you poor beast of burden. Oh, you will never be able to explain your own struggles. You'll need to act like it's just the most condescending.
Yeah.
And all these people are trying to network with her and make her laugh. And she's just sour-faced, mean woman. And I don't want to hit women, but I wanted to walk up and just be like, this one's for Handmaid's Tale.
Take pride in the fact that the modern university system is full of a lot of young Margaret Atwoods, and they're going to be Starbucks baristas for the rest of their lives.
And she's a freaking American academic. You made that point earlier.
Yeah, she's not a Canadian writer. She's an American writer who happens to be Canadian.
She went to school in the States.
Yeah, she did, to Radcliffe College.
Yeah. So if you are, American ruling class adjacent, you're American. I'm sorry, that's not,
So, like I said, it really wasn't until the 80s, which was a century after Bellamy's book, I think I mentioned this point earlier, that's when pop culture finally starts to turn on this trope of the utopian industrialized society and take the opposite trope of the dystopian society run by the corporation.
Until eventually you get the Borg.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Like I said, the corporation... From the 80s onwards, it's now the unambiguously evil antagonist as opposed to just George Jetson's annoying boss. Yeah. We live in an age that's probably closer than ever to Bellamy's all-encompassing corporation, but we've kind of given up on the pretense where everybody could work a little bit and receive enough to get by. Yeah. That's not happening, not based on the rent I'm paying.
No, you're done. You better have saleable skills.
Also, like, large swaths of the population really don't intend to be anything but parasites on the system, but the people in charge still don't see themselves as sophisticated.
Yeah, this is going to be, you got an out-of-touch elite, you got an angry population. Yep. This is going to be great. Knowing history as I do, I know this is going to be a very interesting part of history.
They're going to meet at the negotiating table and hash out a reasonable...
everything's going to be fine. Everything's going to work out. It's going to be a new enlightened age.
Yeah, I'm just saying, like, from the 1960s until the early 2000s, look, however you felt about a social cause, you could go to the political rally say you were trying to make a difference by getting a job in this bureaucracy or just trying to raise awareness. And maybe you supported it, maybe you were just trying to get some tail from an educated, empowered woman who wanted to sleep around to be empowered. But
An echo of the hippie movement.
yeah, I'm just saying nowadays that sex appeal is gone. Like the only pussy you're gonna get from going to a rally or any sort of activist movement is from some BLM supporter with tattoos or a fat chick with a bad haircut, and nobody wants that.
At the recent protests at U of T, they had to put up a big sign on like day 2 being like, "We will not tolerate SA and SA harassment."
You're taking the side of the Palestinians. Yes, you do support it.
I was gonna say, like, oh, I've seen this movie before.
We've finally reached a world where supporting the progressive social cause just has no pretense anymore. You do it because you support the system and you want a bureaucratic job as an apparatchik. It's really the only reason to be a progressive in 2025. You know, before you could do it for some romantic ideals. Now it's just soulless. You want a government job or some DEI job or something like that.
Well, it's straight up social climbing at this point.
Exactly.
I feel like a bunch of people who joined AA, the network.
Yeah.
It's like that level of, exploitation.
Yeah, like I said, we entered 2020 in a world where a young optimist could maybe still believe he was making a difference, but just since the end of those lockdowns, we live in a world where there is nothing but a soulless mechanical system envisioned by one Edward Bellamy in 1888, which, just for the time frame on here, that's the exact same year that Vincent van Gogh was in the south of France, cutting off his ear. Now, to be clear, there is at least one other image of communism, and that's the crunchy agrarian stateless society. The one where we're going to live in harmony with nature. That was always around as well, and of course, it was exemplified in another science fiction novel, William Morris's The News from Nowhere, which was a direct response to Edward Bellamy's novels. So again, even the other view of communism comes from a science fiction novel as well.
Urban, agrarian. Fine, put the hammer and the sickle on the thing. Okay, yay!
William Morris's novel is still Marxist, but I guess it might resonate with someone who wants to live out his days in a fishing village. But if we look at the world of the 1910s, the manifestos that make up the official art history narrative, they're all written against the backdrop of a world where Edward Bellamy's ideas are fresh and there is still enough industrial output to start getting starry-eyed about a society where everybody's a soulless cog in a machine. Seems like a nightmare now, but all of these crazy artistic manifestos were written by... Exactly.
Right.
So that's the worldview going into World War I, where we last left off. Europe was being reduced to rubble and the art world had stopped, but there were still some pockets of activity in neutral countries. Like Piet Mondrian had been trying to make it as an avant-garde artist in Paris, which meant he was dabbling in cubism like every other Paris bohemian. Mm-hmm. He went home to visit his sick father in Amsterdam when the war broke out, and he's not going back to Paris. So that's where he developed De Style, which was this stuff.
Jesus Christ.
Like, because cubism wasn't minimalistic enough, now you have to reduce it to two dimensions.
I'm glad he supports Ukraine.
You also have places like New York, which obviously, at least at the start of the war, the United States wasn't involved. A lot of things changed when they did get involved, but that's where you had Duchamp sticking this monstrosity in the art gallery. And you also had 391. This was published by Francis Picabia, which was another one of these avant-garde total trust fund kids. This is kind of the original Vice magazine or Alternative Weekly. It was the official magazine of the Dada movement, where it's just let's be edgy and publish it from Barcelona.
I know you quoted in an earlier episode Frank Zappa.
Yeah.
And he called himself a Dadaist.
Yeah, I quoted him when I was I was quoting his lyrics about certain Jewish women.
It's a delicate way to put it. I like that. It's an algorithm-friendly way to put it.
But again, just Vice magazine was really not that different from 391. It just had better publishing technology when Gavin McInnes started it. But this is another thing that really hasn't moved 1 millimeter culturally since the 1910s.
It's like offensive for the sake of offensive.
Yeah, basically. Yep.
Yes, we know that's us. Yeah,
I know. I did not say I'm above this. I'm saying this is the cultural milieu that we are a part of, and it's been around for a long time.
Sorry, we're not the we're maybe like the demiurge. We're like in the simulation with you. We can't get you out of it. We're just letting you know what's going on.
So the war eventually ends in 1918. Europe is still the cultural center of the world, even though the Americans now have enough heft on the global stage to shape geopolitics, really since the Spanish-American War. But, you know, they financed the Mexican Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution, and the pièce de résistance is the World War I peace settlement, which really showcases the brilliance of experts, including the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations, and the slogan, making the world safe for democracy, allowing people named Mussolini and Hitler and Lenin and Stalin to say, we truly represent the will of the people.
Yeah. There were some mild cultural differences between the Germanic peoples and the more Western European peoples, and this made democracy almost unworkable.
Yep.
So,
unworkable. It was a whipping boy.
Yeah, pretty much.
A lot of these avant-garde artists at the time, another thing that is important to note is they're also convinced by these charismatic new leaders that their radical ideas are going to be perfectly suited to the propaganda that these dictators need.
Yep. Natural connection.
We will be talking a lot more in the next episode about the political ramifications of the World War I peace settlement and how they affect the art world, but you're going to have a lot less aristocratic art being made in a world where the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns and the Romanovs and the Ottomans have just had their empires abolished.
Yeah.
In the aftermath of World War I, you have a world where America is playing an active role in Europe, but they're still Macbeth, Thane of Cawdor, not Macbeth, King of Scotland yet. Mm. They haven't usurped the throne quite yet. After World War II, they will. That's when the old world truly finishes itself off and the world's cultural center moves to the States. But between 1918 and 1939, Paris is still the place to be. And when an American has money and hires a tutor to educate his children, he'll require that the tutor has a, quote, European sensibility, because European culture is just seen as superior.
Okay. Especially
when it comes to the visual arts. The Americans have not yet adopted this civic nationalist idea that a nation is based on an idea, and that once you've passed your citizenship exam, you're just as American as you and me. That stuff is 20th century gobbledygook. Actually, it comes from the French Revolution, but that's a different story. In the early 1900s, American was just an ethnic identity, no different than French or Bavarian. This is why some of the most famous American artists and writers of the 19th century are people like James Whistler and John Singer Sargent, who live basically their entire lives outside the United States, hobnobbing with European aristocrats, but they're still unambiguously American. In fact, in the case of John Singer Sargent, he's born in Italy, and in his entire life, he only makes a couple of short visits to the United States, but of course he's American, he's ethnically American. We didn't have this 20th century nonsense where you get the passport and therefore you're a part of the country. Like, nobody believed in that nonsense back then.
Well, Hitler considered every European country to be like its own race, basically. Yep. Like, sorry, Eastern European National Socialists.
So the archetype of the American expat in Europe is the person who just spends his time taking in the culture and producing highbrow stuff for the European consumption, And when somebody of American ethnicity could do that, it was seen as a thing of national pride among the Americans. It's kind of weird to just think of the Americans as just another country, because we've grown up in a world where the Americans control everything.
Yeah.
At least at this time, the United States is just any other country, and it's largely a country that's ethnically defined.
Yeah.
Again, there's none of this 20th century snobbery about this artist is American, what does he know? Like, you either produced good art for the aristocracy or you didn't. And the United States is not exactly seen as a backwater either, especially when it comes to literature. In particular, the 19th century had produced two American writers who were total mainstays in the European zeitgeist. One was Edgar Allan Poe, who was kind of viewed as a European fish lost in America, like a fish out of water lost in America. He was viewed as like a man with European sensibilities, but stuck in the world of the almighty dollar. But the second one was Walt Whitman. He was not seen as a European lost in America. He was seen as the embodiment of Americanness. He was a Protestant capital R radical who believed that God's providence was going to transform America into a cultural powerhouse. He wasn't exactly homesteading on the American frontier, but his writing and poetry were just viewed as a portent of great things to come from the New World. Again, this is not the age of Hollywood where the American cultural elites portray the middle of their country as a bunch of backwater rubes ready to be dragged into an enlightened future. That's kind of things that's a stereotype that the American elites place on their own people.
Okay.
The Europeans don't see Americans that way. The Europeans see America as the country that gave us Walt Whitman.
Okay. Hasn't been spoiled yet.
Yep. So, again, the same thing as when you read writings from the era, you see phrases like the optimism of Edward Bellamy. It's the same thing. You see phrases like, we are waiting for America to produce someone who transforms painting the way Walt Whitman transformed poetry. This is important because after World War I, a whole bunch of Americans had the opportunity to cosplay John Singer Sargent. The continent had just blown itself up. So you can go play Bohemian at a discount for a few years in Paris.
At a strong currency.
Yeah. Yep. So most famously, you have the Lost Generation authors like Hemingway and Ezra Pound and F. Scott Fitzgerald living in Paris. Really, any American who wanted an aura of sophistication and had a trust fund could just go live in the rubble of Europe for a couple of years. And had World War II not happened, that might have just been a bit of a detail or a footnote. But the seeds of American art post-World War II, and thus prestige art, are really sown at this point. And there's this attitude throughout a lot of 20th century culture that the Europeans are the enlightened ones and the Americans are the backwater.
Yeah, like I was always like, growing up, it was always like, we'll send you to Europe to be cultured.
Yeah. Now look, I have seen who watches Formula One. These people are not more sophisticated than NASCAR fans. They drink wine instead of Bud Light. That's the only difference. So,
when society's admitted that like these people can't take care of themselves, the Americans have not figured that part out.
Well, second of all, though, the Europeans they had already kind of accepted the Americans as equal. Like this idea of America backwards is, like I said, it's an American idea and just largely an inferiority complex exacerbated by the fact that Europe is being forced to accept American progressivism since the end of World War II, and the American ruling class looks at the welfare states in Europe and say, why can't we have that here? Because Europe blew itself up and you forced them to get it.
A lot of places end up kind of like laboratories for American ideas.
Yep.
Which is
we live in Canada.
Yeah. Which is another consequence of a strong American dollar.
Yep. Oh, go watch that episode. That was one of our first ones. There's a reason that Saddam Hussein is no longer with us. And it has to do with that strong American dollar, or at least trying to keep it strong. So it's always seemed funny to me to watch some stiff upper lip British auctioneer at Sotheby's talking about how some piece of shit from the Museum of Modern Art or some other New York institution is sophisticated. But again, the truth is that's just my 20th and 21st century bias. That's my new world projection of sophistication onto the old world. I know what British people are like. Half my family's British.
You're not going to lie to us.
No. I know what British tourists are like. As much as, American tourists tend to, bring out certain emotions in the locals, I don't understand why English tourists go to places and spend the whole day at the pub drinking with other English tourists.
That's what they do. And the rougher side of that is the hooligans that come to Toronto now because of the freaking Scott, the Toronto has a soccer club now.
Yeah.
So,
oh yeah.
Toronto's being initiated into hooligan culture.
Poe and Whitman, they're proof that Europeans never really looked down on the Americans in the first place. America is seen as the cutting edge of literature. It's seen as a place that had changed architecture with its skyscrapers. And again, the old world doesn't look down on the Americans. The old world is just expecting new and great things to come from America. And as far as the narrative goes in the 21st century, at this point, American art still has to catch up because it's stuffy and academic. The Armory show had been a few years earlier, and according to the narrative, modern art was just getting a foothold. That story is bullshit. Let's just take a look at this cartoon from 1915. It's called How to Become a Post-Impressionist Paint Slinger. It's exactly what we're talking about today.
We're not the first to notice.
Yeah. It's it's about, if you're not watching this on YouTube, it's making fun of an artist just tossing a bunch of paint on the canvas, then calling it a work of art and showing it off to a bunch of sophisticated people. Now look at the date on this. This is March 6th, 1913.
Yeah.
This never happened that people started viewing this stuff as more intellectual. People knew it was bullshit then. People know it's bullshit now. It's just at some point along the line, the academic narrative around this art changed. But nobody ever liked this nonsense. It's not like we have more modern sensibilities. No, it was bullshit then, it's bullshit now. To read the rest of it at the bottom because it's written in...
Is this for ants?
The text at the bottom of this cartoon, if you can't read it, it says, first down 8 pints of absinthe, then toss paint randomly on the canvas, then call it Aurora Borealis at Mount Chimborazo. That's a pretty good description of what modern art is now. I'm not going to lie.
Remember when I grew my own absinthe bush? Those were fun times.
So, this art, people knew back then that it looks like it takes no effort, and the snarky comments don't even feel the least bit dated. I'm sure if you read old comic strips like the Cats and Jammer Kids or whatever else comes from the 1910s, I'm sure a lot of that humor just wouldn't hold up. This holds up perfectly.
Yeah, they're still doing this. And we're still doing this.
So, yeah.
Like Sisyphus pushing that rock up the hill.
Yeah. Now, the thing I want to make clear about this is the narrative talks about how America was behind and America needed to catch up to the Europeans. At the time, Americans just viewed the Europeans as being weird. The Americans were well aware of what the Europeans were doing. The art critic for the New York Herald Tribune was a guy named Royal Cortesaz. I hope I pronounced that properly.
Like fucking Star Wars villain.
He was a stalwart of the old-fashioned academic style of painting, and he put it bluntly in 1923 when he called it Ellis Island art. So just to be very, very clear, it's not that the Americans were trying to catch up to the Europeans. The Americans saw this stuff and they're like, this is like those WAPs.
Yeah. It's like those awful.
I hope that doesn't get us demonetized, but fuck it if it does. This is at the height of the national debate over whether the Americans should close the border when, again, certain ethnic groups, mostly the Italians, had overstayed their welcome. And the next year, in 1924, the Immigration Act is passed, and the Americans decide that the tired, poor, huddled masses can go be tired, poor, and huddled in somewhere. They can go be tired, poor, and huddled in their own countries.
Yeah.
Now, it may seem kind of weird to us now, but again, there was a time when the New England WASP ruling class of America just looked down on European art as being Philistine and unsophisticated. So again, there's something else wrong with the narrative here. From the day the Mayflower set sail, though, the Achilles heel of the Puritan has always been the same thing. They get pussy whipped by their henpecking wives.
To the modern, WASP CEO.
Yep. When a rich American thinks that the Europeans are churning out shit, but his housewife wants to be admired by socialites when they take a trip to London or Paris, the wife is always going to win. The classic example of this is former Secretary of the Treasury Larry Summers, who decided to go to Jeffrey Epstein to get a loan for his wife's book of poetry after the Epstein scandal had broken.
Jesus Christ. The ruling class, ladies and gentlemen.
I need to keep her off my ass loan for my wife. Who do I go to? Jeff.
Yeah, he's not under any suspicion.
Usually the people like going to Epstein's island were a bunch of tech nerds who he wanted blackmail on. This is just he wants financing for his wife's poetry book.
Yeah, he's gonna keep that chick happy.
So after World War I, for a few years in Europe, rich people wanted to turn the page on all of that destruction. So the rich Europeans started buying some of the non-academic pieces of art for their collections. This includes the avant-garde art of the 1910s, like the Cubist and the Futurist stuff. But it also includes stuff going as far back as the Impressionists, which was 60 years old at this point. Sotheby's and Christie's records from the 20s and the 30s, they don't exactly show an overnight shift, as a lot of the academic pieces were still being bought and sold. But, previously avant-garde art had been the domain of the eccentric bougie nouveau riche types, like the Stein family. But now all the fancy people wanted to buy Monets and Renoirs and Van Goghs, Gauguins, Cézannes, Matisses, Picassos, etc. And as I think I mentioned this in the last episode, Picasso was now part of high society, but not due to his art, but because he designed the sets and costumes for the ballet, which was the equivalent in the 1920s, at least in 1920s Paris, to directing a movie like Fight Club that entered the zeitgeist.
Okay.
Yeah, ballet used to be that important.
I wonder what happened. We still give girls freaking eating disorders over it.
Yeah.
So I guess there's that.
Enter the Rockefeller family. Abby Rockefeller, the wife of John D. Rockefeller Jr., and her blue blood socialite friends Lily P. Bliss and Mary Queen Sullivan.
Oh, wow.
They decided that there needed to be a venue in New York where they could showcase the Ellis Island art and just tell the unwashed masses about how sophisticated it is. The unwashed masses see this cartoon and are like, yeah, this is garbage. But Mrs. Rockefeller and her friends are going to just prove to the masses just how sophisticated they are by just understanding this, whatever the fuck this is.
Embracing this nonsense.
The proles might laugh at the newspaper comics, saying it looks like a crazy Frenchman tossed a bucket of paint, but the sophisticated people are going to explain why the paint splatters are actually intellectual.
Okay.
And in 1929, they found the Museum of Modern Art in the living room of the Rockefeller family. And the attendance roll of this meeting it reads like a who's who of the American industrial class. The first president of MoMA was Anson Goodyear of the Goodyear family, the tires, the rubber family.
It's like the protocols.
Yeah. The also present were Josephine Crane of the Crane Paper Manufacturing Company.
Wow.
Paul Sachs, namesake of Goldman Sachs. Frank Crowninshield, he was the editor of Vanity Fair, and if you're not familiar, the Crowninshield is one of the really old New England money families. He's there as well. So, to this day, the Museum of Modern Art, it's a central node in the art world, and it leans on its reputation as a showcase for upstart visionaries. The reality, it has always been a playground for rich Americans to put ugly shit on a pedestal and then admire themselves for staring at it.
It's like the frickin' it's the ruling class's equivalent of like putting their kids' terrible art on the refrigerator.
Yes.
But they can do it on a much larger scale.
Yep. Oh, just all you have to do is just put a blurb about the piece's context. That's all you need. You're not just staring at a blob of paint. You're staring at a blob of paint that was inspired by the artist's absinthe-fueled bender.
Yep.
Especially if it was Vincent van Gogh and he described that absinthe-fueled bender to his brother in one of those letters.
Jesus.
I guess the modern parallel would be like the article in Pitchfork about how there's something profound in the lyrics of Drake or Jay-Z. Like, you can analyze hip-hop music all you want. I'm sorry, you're never going to find anything but weak lyrics and weak bass lines. Oh, also, I mean, the recent allegations against Diddy kind of revealed some things about the whole enterprise of rap music.
Yeah, there was something going on there.
Yeah.
I didn't believe Cat Williams when he came out and said it was like some kind of gay mafia running the thing.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what it is. Hey, the
Taliban,
yeah.
right?
Rap music turned out just to be just an excuse for hedonists in the entertainment industry to indulge their bi-curious fantasies, but that's what it turned out to be.
When a culture is repressed and religious, you sometimes see some freaking,
Yeah.
Chase nature out the front door. You're gonna see it come in a window or the back door in this case.
Yeah, well, just as the hip-hop industry was a showcase for gay jungle fever, the Museum of Modern Art, it's always been an excuse for New York socialites to show off at the cocktail party at the Hamptons. And again, like I said, in the progressive era, the elites were a bunch of sexual degenerates as well. That's not
as far as I
anything
can
either.
tell, elites are they're always sexual degenerates. It doesn't seem to matter.
But especially now.
Yeah. Well, it's just wherever you go in the world, anytime, if we have any of the, if we have any of the nitty gritty of the personal lives of the ruling class, it's always effed up.
Oh, yeah.
Always. That's just a constant throughout our species. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, there's a Latin phrase, de gustibus non disputandum est, meaning in matters of taste, there can be no disputes. So if you find the paint splatter to be aesthetically pleasing or inspirational, good on you, I guess. I hope you buy it and it's a conversation piece that inspires lots of mentally stimulating discourse. All I'm saying is that as far as the Museum of Modern Art goes, it's about as avant-garde as buying a poster of Donald Duck from the gift shop at Disney World. It's completely corporate.
Yeah.
MoMA is a corporate institution, and it has been from day one. As far as the United States goes, prestige art is almost, by definition, art that has the imprimatur of the Museum of Modern Art. We revisited the question, what is art? From the 1760s onward, it was defined institutionally. Art was whatever the Royal Academy or the Académie des Beaux-Arts and the intellectual heirs to Joshua Reynolds said it was, and whatever they allowed to be sold in the salons. The definition was never controversial until you have this self-sustaining community of bohemians outside of the system. But fast forwarding a bit, when the United States and the USSR are the only countries left standing after World War II and paint is widely available and anyone can take an art class, art is just by definition whatever has MoMA's seal of approval. It's still institutional, it's just a different institution. Of course, that doesn't yet explain why 20th century art was hideous and uninspiring, but at least we have a villain, because MoMA is the arbiter of taste now, and if art is supposed to be uplifting and transcendental, we now know who failed in their duty. And for whatever reason, this institution, it pretends to be a communal showcase for a bunch of starving and up-and-coming bohemians. It isn't. Like I said, it's as institutional as the Disney Corporation, and it always has been. But just to put a button on this whole story, we talked about the Montmartre scene during the Belle Epoque and how a handful of independent artists worked and found fame outside Paris's formal salon system. And we talked about Cézanne, Gauguin, Seurat, and Van Gogh, who are all part of the narrative. And we also said that the biggest names of the day, Meissonier, Bouguereau, and Jerome, for some reason were not part of the narrative now. Yeah. Here's why. Here is the inaugural loan exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art. Look what it's called. Cézanne, Gauguin, Seurat, and Van Gogh. Okay. These artists are important because the Museum of Modern Art gave them a exhibition. That's it. Jesus. Here's some pictures from the inaugural exhibit. We're now art history experts, so hopefully you can look at these 4 paintings and figure out who belongs to whom. It's an interesting exercise. It's not hard to Google these paintings and figure out who they are, but I will. There's the 4 paintings on the right. I'm not sure who the one on the far left was, but the 4 paintings, the first 4 paintings starting on the right, one of them belongs to each one of those 4 artists. Here, I'll show you the first 2. Can you figure out who those are? Got a guess?
I'm drawing a blank.
Well, that's Van Gogh on the left. I think that's very Van Gogh-ish. That's Cézanne on the right. He was the one with all the weird fucked up angles and lines. Okay. And the one on the left, that's Seurat. That's the same guy who did the Pointless painting, the Ferris Bueller painting.
And then Homie with the South Pacific.
Yeah, exactly. That's Gauguin. So there you go. Like I said, when I started this, I don't think I could have pointed those out, but now I've been staring at this stuff for, 4 or 5 months trying to get to the bottom of this. I didn't have to pay for an art history degree. I did it in a couple months.
Homie went deep.
Mm-hmm. So that was after World War II when the United States won all the marbles, but we haven't gotten there yet. We're still in the rubble of World War I when the older establishment Americans still think Ellis Island art is just modern shit. Success in American art still kind of means impressing the old world tastemakers, but there's just one problem. All those tastemakers have disappeared, either because they were killed in the war, and a lot of nobles were killed in the war. This idea that war has always been fought by the poor, not World War I. Like, I think
all these idiots.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
The first war, I think, with like truly effective artillery.
Yeah. Oh, the first battle of World War I was started with a cavalry charge.
Yeah. That'll let you know, like the technological freaking.
Yeah.
The learning curve of World War I, shall we say?
Yeah. So either they were all killed in the war, or else Woodrow Wilson's peace settlement just dissolved a lot of aristocracy. So. Even at this time, American creatives were trying to impress the old world. It was just hard to tell what that meant after World War I. So we're still trying to figure out how, on the first day of the Great War in 1914, prestige art was the beautiful academic paintings of nature and gladiators, and in 1950, prestige art was Jackson Pollock splooging on the canvas. We've seen a little bit of random chaos in people like Kandinsky, but those guys were at best seen as eccentrics, and that brings us back to Claude Monet. Like I said, this whole episode was just about one guy, and I know it's going on just as long as all the other episodes, but I needed to build up the context properly, the historical context, and this brings us back to Claude Monet. Like I said, he moved out to Giverny in 1883, right around the time that Impressionism is just running out of steam and starting to become passé. And he does something a little bit unusual. It's not uncommon for painters to do a series of the same painting 4 or 5 times. But Monet will start painting various subjects dozens of times, but always in a different weather or in a different season or at a different time of day, or sometimes just even in a different mood. He'll always use a different palette or different brush strokes to paint the same thing. So also remember one thing, the narrative talks about how Van Gogh was the guy who truly released color. We see that this is bullshit.
That was Lincoln.
Well,
Thank you.
the narrative talks about Van Gogh as being the guy who released color because he was using all these bright, vibrant, expressive colors in his paintings. Bullshit as well. Monet was alive the whole time. Monet outlived Van Gogh for 30 years. And Monet was older than Van Gogh. But yeah, Monet was doing all this weird experimentation with color as well. So like if Van Gogh didn't exist, nothing would be that different. Sorry, Vincent.
Doctor Who would be different.
Doctor Who would be different. All right. So here's just an example of him painting the same thing in many different colors and many different styles. This is a cliff that was near where he lived, and he probably painted dozens of these paintings, just like I said, at a different time of day and a different weather. Like the one on the bottom left, I think that's a sunrise or a sunset. The one on the bottom right is in calm weather. The one at the top right is in a sunset, but very different palettes, very different brush strokes, very different styles.
It shows you the depth of
Yep.
the
And
landscape.
he does dozens of these. It's called the Cliff at Etowah. That's what it was called. Again, here's 4 more of them, and I think he probably had like 24 of these, just over and over, painting this using different colors, using a different palette, using different moods. So don't tell me Vincent van Gogh was the first guy to really get creative with colors, whether they were realistic or not. No. This was going on at exactly the same time.
He just had a good agent.
Oh, Vincent van Gogh didn't have a good agent. That's the
Oh,
complete
his brother.
opposite. He still didn't have a good agent. No, Vincent van Gogh wrote letters to his brother, so he got to really see the depths of his depravity, and humanity loves a good train wreck.
Yeah, we do.
Why do you think we still pay attention to Britney Spears? Is it because she's putting out good music? Is it because she ever put out good music?
Well, even to the body cam footage, it's all over YouTube right now.
Yeah.
People love a train wreck.
What else did Van Gogh do? He did a bunch of paintings of haystacks. I think he did about 40 of these. And again, some of these, like the one on the bottom left, that's in winter in the snow. The one on the top is at sunset. Just keeps painting the same haystacks over and over and over again.
This would have been Sonic the Hedgehog if he'd been born.
Yeah.
Like, you know, modern day.
Well, like, he's not some young autistic guy. He's guy's already made his money at this point. He's at least middle-aged. I think he's probably in his 50s when he's doing this stuff. Like, he doesn't have anything to prove now, so he's moved out to his cottage, and he just keeps painting the same thing over and over and over in as many different ways as he can.
That's probably what Zuckerberg's doing on his island.
Yeah.
Just painting the same
If
thing.
we're lucky.
Yeah.
If we're lucky. Here's some more of these haystacks. Again, it's basically the same subject matter, but
Only like haystacks.
it's just 3 very different fields to these 3 paintings, and yet it's the same subject matter all 3 times. This is a tree in some mountain pass. It's just called the Old Tree. Again, here really the only thing he does differently is the brush strokes with all 3 of these. But again, he'll keep painting the same thing over and over and do a whole bunch of them. I can't remember what this one's called, but again, you see the same rock formation. These are poplar trees on the River Ept. Again, exact same trees, but these are 3 completely different pictures. You know, these 3 paintings would look very different if you put them over your fireplace. This is Rouen Cathedral. That's another one that I think he did 10 or so paintings of. Like the one in the top middle, I think, was in the fog. The one in the bottom middle was in sunset. Just again, he it's impressionist. Like he's not using really fine brush strokes on these. These are all like more conceptual than realistic, but just by changing the color palette, he completely changes the painting. But there's one subject that he's especially remembered for, and in Giverny he had gotten permission to redirect a river to create a lily pond, and he spends the last 2 decades of his life painting water lilies in every way imaginable. Some, they use bright realistic colors, some are more expressive and less realistic, some are more ethereal and dreamlike. Some have aggressive brushwork, some have gentle brushwork, but he does 250 of these. Like, this is just for the last 2 decades of his life what he spends a bunch of time doing. This is like a bridge that he has in his garden.
Freaking Buddha.
Yeah. Here's again the same bridge, 2 completely different paintings, but it just goes on and on and on. Like just painting the lilies. Apparently, like he'll get up early in the morning, paint till about 2 in the afternoon, spend time with his grandchildren, and go to bed so he can rinse and repeat. And he, yeah, basically, he spends the last, I think, 25 years of his life or so doing this. So this is what I'm saying about how Monet's water lilies just don't really fit into the narrative, because chronologically this is where he does them. We talked about Monet a long time ago, and you can kind of see something that maybe is the genesis of Jackson Pollock's aesthetic when you look at this.
I can see that.
Again, this starts to answer a couple more of the mysteries, like how does art seem to look like whatever the fuck Jackson Pollock did. But with all the changes we've been talking about, in the background, Monet is still alive, and his longtime dealer, Paul Durand-Ruel, he's still alive. So Monet is still making these paintings. He is still selling his paintings. But avant-garde art has moved on to other things, especially Cubism. He's kind of had his moment in the sun. He's now the old guy at the cottage, still doing his works, but wealthy enough that it just really doesn't matter if they sell or not.
Okay.
He'll do this as a labor of love if he wants to. But his wife dies. He starts getting cataracts. He's in his 70s, and he decides to call it a career. But he is friends with French former Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau from his early days in Paris as a bohemian, because Clemenceau was a journalist back in the day. Clemenceau is no longer the prime minister, but he still is a pretty high-up politician, and nothing motivates an artist quite like a well-connected politician willing to be your patron.
Oh, yeah.
So Clemenceau sees his friend Monet in this despondent state and says, hey, Claude, if you produce some really big water lily paintings, I could probably pull some strings to make it a really big exhibit. And they kind of talk about having his paintings surround a room with a 360-degree mural. But then World War I breaks out. Mm-hmm. And Giverny is nowhere near the front, but conscription tends to drain the young talent from your communities.
Ask Russia.
Yeah, well, I think, you know how we don't clear-cut forest anymore because we grow forests specifically for the sake of cutting them down? I think Russia has towns just for the sake of growing soldiers.
Gopnik growing.
Am I wrong?
Probably not.
No. World War I breaks out. I guess Giverny, it's the site of a war hospital, and the village is still going to be quite profoundly affected by the war, even if it doesn't get blown to hell. And France is going to continue its losing streak against Germans coming over the Rhineland. France is a country with a really good military history, as much as we'd like to rip on them, but sometimes somebody just has your number.
I was, one of the meanest things I think I said to a guy is this guy from France was chirping me, and I said, sir, before you start anything, I want you to consider the military history of your people. France
is a country, like I said, it has a great military history. The problem is a lot of it is civil wars.
Yeah.
So Monet is in his mid-70s and he's growing blind. But he says, you know what? I'm not going anywhere. If the Germans blow up the village, I'm going with it. I'm going to die in front of my paintings. So he ignores the evacuation orders, and he's just going to keep painting his lily pond. Clemenceau, at some point during the war, he actually becomes prime minister again, and he makes sure that the war effort is going to include two things. It's going to include providing Monet with painting supplies, and it's going to involve providing Monet with cigarettes.
Jesus. It's good to have friends in high places.
It's important because since the Impressionists broke off in the 1870s and started selling their works independently, largely to Americans, the French state never really took them seriously. The real art was still the art that came to the Paris Salon. A state supply of paint and cigarettes was the closest thing that the Impressionists ever had to a large-scale state commission. On the day after the armistice was signed, Monet was 78 years old, and he writes Clemenceau a letter formally offering to paint a series of big panels of water lilies and donate them to the state as part of a war memorial. Now, usually a war memorial is some sort of a statue, so a room full of Impressionist murals is, to say the least, unconventional. But Clemenceau, he's the prime minister, and he sees to it that one of the national museums is going to have a dedicated space for what we might now call, in the modern art parlance, an art installation. Jesus. So Monet, he works on them from 1920 until 1926, and he is in his 80s at this point. He's a perfectionist. On at least one occasion, he cuts up and destroys several of his panels and starts again. A lot of people think that he never really wanted to finish them because it was a project just keeping him alive, making him get up out of bed in the morning. But he dies aged 86, and they open up the gallery at the Musée de l'Orangerie, the Orangerie Museum, which is now sometimes called the Sistine Chapel of Impressionism. So this is the picture I showed at the start.
Full circle.
These water lily paintings become the so-called Grande Décoration. There are two oval rooms, each surrounded completely by 2-meter tall oil paint murals of the surface of a lily pond with no visible horizon, and the sky is only visible as a reflection, like on the one on the left. There's loose brush strokes, there's a few willow branches in a general somber mood because it's at least informally a contemplation of World War I. And for all the pretentious talk about abstraction in the works and the manifestos of the avant-garde artists, it actually does almost make some sense when you look at this work. But it was not one of these young upstart artists who did it. It was an 85-year-old. Later on in the 20th century, Mark Rothko, who I've got a lot of things to say about in a future episode, he tries to convince everybody that he's doing something profound by making dimly lit rooms full of paintings that are just rectangles of random color. But let's just take a look at this. These are Monet's paintings. Like, just at the top, you see the full mural, what it would look like from a distance. This is the level of detail he has. The level of detail is not all that precise. He's, like I said, he's in the 80s and going blind, but you still see the water lilies, and you still see the branches, and you see everything that an actual garden would look like. This is the one with the clouds, and it's not very much detail in this one at all, but still
Gets the point across.
Looks like you're looking at the reflection of the sky on the surface of a pond. This one, if you look at the little one, if you look at the small picture in the middle, it's even got kind of shitty detail on it, but from a distance, it still, I think, looks decent. And this is the one showing the sunrise. So it kind of, like, as you go around, it's supposed to show different times of the day.
Okay.
So this is what Monet did. This is what Rothko did. Really?
Christ. Right back to the black.
Exactly. I'm sorry. Like, these people all thought that they were profound. Like, I can buy the argument that Monet was profound. No, not this.
I have seen more profound construction sites.
Now, according to the narrative, Monet's installation is a critical part of the story of art, because finally a non-salon painter has produced something that is being recognized as a national treasure. This is, I guess, like when the symphony plays the Star Wars theme. You can't deny that it's now part of the culture. And we're still trying to figure out how Jackson Pollock's Lavender Mist becomes serious art, but Monet's Water Lilies really are the first large-scale art that kind of looks like a Jackson Pollock painting.
Okay.
But the problem, like so many other things in the narrative, it's all bullshit. Whatever you think of the movie The Adventures of Pluto Nash, you can't really say it's part of the broader culture, because the movie was a flop that lost $100 million. I'm not going to say it's the low point in Eddie Murphy's life, but it was the low point in Eddie Murphy's life that didn't involve getting caught with a transsexual prostitute.
Yeah, that's another one of these black guys living on the DL.
He claims he didn't know she was transsexual, but
they make it pretty clear, I'm pretty sure. I don't think there's like...
He does a lot of cross-dressing in his movies. Yeah. Played the whole Klumps family.
It's the one thing you won't talk about in an interview. One thing his brother wouldn't joke about on the Chappelle Show.
The Orangery opened in 1927, and it went over like a fart in the wind. Nobody cared about Monet's Water Lilies paintings. The serious art collectors in France, they still want the academic stuff, and they see Monet's Water Lilies as just low-class garbage. The artsy-fartsy types in Montmartre, they don't give a shit about some 86-year-old impressionist's vanity project. They're into the cubists and all whatever else they're into. Like, and especially not some 86-year-old's project that only came into existence because he was friends with the prime minister. Mm-hmm. That doesn't give you any indie cred. Mm. It's like going to see Woody Allen play in his jazz band in New York. Yes, he still does it at age 89. Yes, it's probably a bucket list item for some baby boomers. But the youngest person who cares about seeing Woody Allen play a clarinet is like 37. And that 37-year-old is already the eccentric member of his friend group.
Yeah, he's unusual.
So in reality, yes, the room was set up as a sacred space for contemplation, but it's...
Thinking about all our dead kids.
Yeah, but that's what it's supposed to be, but it's just, in reality, the extra room at the museum that you use when you need an event space. Like, during the Nazi occupation bombing raid, and actually a friendly fire bombing raid by the Allies, damages the building, and some of the panels start taking water damage, and the damage report decades after shows a bunch of mold from neglect.
That's awesome.
After World War II, the museum has a hard time finding money for the restoration efforts. Yeah. Does this honestly sound like a national treasure? Does this sound like an important work of art? It doesn't sound like it to me either. So why the hell are Monet's Water Lilies and his grand decorations now viewed as a sacred space for contemplation when nobody gave a shit at the time? Why indeed? Because in 1960, the Museum of Modern Art has a Monet exhibition where they show a bunch of the original Water Lilies paintings, and now the Americans start to view the installation as super important. Which means a bunch of American tourists start flocking to Paris to see the Grande Décoration. And it's not until well into the 1960s that the museum starts treating the space as a significant French landmark, as opposed to just the room that's used when the museum needs an extra room. Like, conservation efforts on the water lilies really start in the 1980s, trying to repair World War II damage 40 years after the fact. So I keep saying the narrative is bullshit. The narrative's bullshit. We really do see the reality of 20th century art, though, in black and white, just from looking at one work of art. We said that it was like something out of 1984, where the most famous artists in the year 1900 seem to be completely airbrushed out of the conversation. You don't need to know Meissonier and Bouguereau to get on Jeopardy, but you do need to know Matisse and Picasso. Art is still going on in Europe, but nobody cares about it, or at least the Museum of Modern Art doesn't care about it. On the other hand, if something later becomes important in America, and by that, again, I mean it gets called important by MoMA, it retroactively gets called a pioneering work. And if you don't agree with MoMA's aesthetic choices, well, we're not going to kill you for blasphemy, but you're just a Philistine. We love you, but you're like our retarded country bumpkin cousin who just doesn't get high culture. This is the reality of the 20th century after Europe blows itself in the 1940s. Everything is just as curated, but there's a different set of curators, and they don't seem to be doing a very good job. Instead of aristocrats inviting artists to their court to impress everyone with their portraits, instead of every country having its own unique style, you just have one institution in New York City that decides what counts as art. That institution sells itself as just being a venue that passively showcases the latest talent, but it is a vanity project of the Rockefeller family. And in those days, there was no pretense. J.D. Morgan owns the Democratic Party, and the Rockefellers own the Republican Party. For all the talk of the New World being the land of the free, and the old world aristocratic ways being finished now that the world is safe for democracy, nothing counts as art unless it has the approval of the US government.
What a dystopian nightmare.
Or at least corporate America and the money from New England, but I repeat myself. Just as importantly, though, universities will not teach a single narrative of art history that differs from the official literature published by the Museum of Modern Art. And that is what we now call the narrative. To see just how much this one institution determines everything, in 1936, MoMA has an exhibition called Cubism and Abstract Art. And I want you to look at the cover of the publication that comes out of this event. If you have been following along with this whole story the last 6 episodes, this chart is exactly what we've been talking about. Or at least what we've been talking about when we talk about painting in Paris outside of the academies and the salons. In fact, it follows that story just a little too closely. The image I have of avant-garde art is a bunch of bohemians trying their weird things, then a few of them ride the wave of survivorship bias, and decades later you look back and see what survived. This is a publication in 1936 that tells you exactly what avant-garde art is in 1936. It's 250 pages full of essays. It talks about post-impressionism and fauvism and cubism and futurism and Dada and surrealism. And the thing is, if you listen to any university art professor talking about these art movements, they are going to tell you exactly what is written in this publication.
Nobody checked.
This is the part of the movie Spaceballs where they find the VHS of Spaceballs and watch it to see what happens next. Or like the part in The Dark Tower where the characters meet Stephen King and read his manuscripts to figure out what comes next in the story. Surprise, we live in a carefully constructed narrative where we are swimming in so much propaganda that we can literally find a script and a blueprint for the story of 20th century art.
It's a bummer.
Yep. Yeah, why were these art movements viewed as important? They're viewed as important because they appear on this chart.
Yep. Nobody checked. Nobody just trusted this.
Sorry to disenchant some things, but there you go. MoMA's website contains the publications for all of its major exhibitions since it opened in 1929. And if you want to understand enough art to impress any liberal arts majors, just go read through them. You will never be a poser because you are literally reading the decisions of the people who arbitrate what is or isn't art.
Jesus Christ.
If you wonder why we live in a world where universities seem to make up really stupid theories and then every corporate and government institution has to write those retarded theories into their policies, I give you the template, the Museum of Modern Art.
Thanks.
You also see the template of the pile of industrial refuse accompanied by the essay or blurb about how it challenges us to have a conversation about race or gender or whatever. It's not about whether it makes sense. It's about whether you can convince the trust fund kids at MoMA to write it in one of their programs. And if you can, then objectively speaking, it's a valid academic theory about art. And if you can't, then objectively speaking, it isn't. Of course, that's the case after 1945. We still need to get to 1945. Things are far from settled in 1918, but we know where it ends, with European culture being finished and one American museum deciding what art is legitimate, and a world where everything is hideous but accompanied with a nonsensical paragraph about starting conversations. So that's our bottle episode about the water lilies, which turned out to be just as long as all of our other episodes. Sorry about that. But in the next couple of episodes, we're going to finally start connecting A to B. We have to talk about the avant-garde artists becoming the mouthpieces of dictators. We have to talk about the narrative kind of where we left off and talk about Dada and Surrealism in the 1920s. We have to talk about the New York avant-garde, which is going to unseat Paris after World War II. And we also have to talk about just how the hell the 1930s cultural context was completely airbrushed out of history. That's important as well. But most importantly out of everything, we can start connecting the dots and finally ask how the Monet painting on the left turned into the piece of shit on the right.
Yeah. I'm still curious, but I learned a lot.
Well, curious, but you at least see some of the resemblance between the two.
Yeah.
The one on the right's called Abstract Expressionism. It's not supposed to look like anything other than kid finger painting. The one on the left is Monet's painting is called Morning on the Seine. It's supposed to be the surface of the river reflecting the sky above it.
Okay.
So again, that I can see the beauty in that. It's still maybe not an old Renaissance painting, but it looks like something real.
And you're fishing in the morning. Good memory there.
The one on the right is just a piece of garbage, but you can kind of see how the dots are starting to be connected from A to B. And that's what we are really going to start looking at in the next episode. Because looking at these two paintings, you have Monet, whose genius I'm not going to deny, but the one on the right, it's by a guy named Schuler, and his genius I will deny until my dying breath.
Sure.
And we'll call that an episode.
All right, you know the drill. Like and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Support us at kofi.com/Radio Free History or at subscribestar.com/radio-free-history.